Good evening, everybody. I think we may have one or two more committee members. I did get a note from Sevi this afternoon that he's not able to make it. But thank you all for coming again. I guess I need to do this. And thank you to HCAM for televising this. This is a really big step for us, for our consultant team to do a presentation on the initial findings that they have come to from everything from the visioning sessions to the core assessment meetings to the meetings that they've been having in some of our discussions. I'm going to let Judy Barrett do a more detailed rundown of what will go on this evening and how we will take and move forward from that. But I will remind everybody we're televised. When it comes time for Q&A, just be sure and use the microphone. I'll say it again if more folks from the public come, but as we've typically run these master plan meetings, these are the rare opportunity for all of us to get together and talk about this stuff in detail and to speak with our consultants. We still definitely want to hear from the public. We have a board up there, so if there are any comments that folks may have from the presentation that's done to the master plan committee, to please post those up there in writing. We will take them all in. It's very difficult for us to have a Q&A either between the audience in the committee or the audience and the consultants and that kind of thing at this time. We want as much comment as we can get from the public. We've been, I think, all very pleased with the amount of interest that has been shown thus far from the more than dozen or 15 visioning sessions that we did in November and December to the something like 950 responses we got from the online survey. So the feedback has been great. We're going to take all that in along with the work from the consultants. But that's how we're going to generally work it with the audience here in the meeting this evening. With that, if there are no comments from members of the committee, if anybody has anything they want to say or questions they want to have, I'm going to turn it over to Judy to give us sort of a rundown on what we'll do for the rest of the evening.
So thank you. First of all, when you leave tonight, we have a present for you, for each of you on that table over there. There's a stack of documents. Two of them are loose stapled, and another set is in an envelope. Don't leave without them. You won't be quizzed, but I want to tell you what is over there. We have started to give Mary what we call inventory and assessment documents. These are strictly existing condition, trends, some initial observations. They're not about strategies. They're just kind of where you are today. And we always kind of do that before we try to get to, I think, what maybe many people are eager to get to, which is the what are we going to do? Because if we're not clear and accurate about what you have today, we could end up building a plan on incomplete or inaccurate information. So the inventories are very key. So we've been sending some to Mary to review, and she's had other staff looking at them. We're going to start tonight giving you, these are drafts, so please understand that. In the envelope up there, there is a draft of the sustainability section, again, inventory and assessment. And public facilities, and then also a draft of a vision and goals document, which comes out of the visioning process and things that we heard from the core assessments and so forth, but mainly the visioning and the survey process. Those are drafts, and so when you read them, I want you to be thinking about, well, do I agree with this? Is this really sort of the direction where I think Hingham should go? You're going to have plenty of time to sort of give us some feedback and comments on the vision and the goals. If you're wondering why you're getting that now instead of having the whole baseline first, it's simply this. This is an iterative process, planning. Some of this is inventory at the outset. Some of it is kind of where you want to go. And ultimately what you're trying to do is bring together the sort of where the community says it wants to go with where it seems to be going based on existing conditions and trends. So you're going to see more inventory and assessment documents over the next few weeks. The two that are in the envelope tonight, we kind of felt were sort of ready to go. I will share with you that Mary and the staff are kind of doing the very picky, thank God, picky look at typos and correct street names and, you know, things like that a consultant hates to make a mistake about, but sometimes you do. You folks don't need to read at that level. What we really want you to do is think kind of up here and let the staff help us with, I guess, what I would call the sort of technical mistakes. So that's the kind of feedback we're going to be looking to you for, is does this sort of present a whole picture of where the town is today for each one of these sections? And if you think we're really missing something, that's kind of what we need to know. And let the staff continue to kind of help us with the technical kinds of minutia, I guess I would call it, but important minutia. So those documents are in the envelope up there. And then Mary has put out 2 other handouts from Metropolitan Area Planning Council, I believe, a net zero presentation, and then what was the other one? I'm sorry. The Metro Common presentation, this data and so forth. So you'll have a lot of reading material to take with you. We have a few more inventory documents that are almost ready to go. We just couldn't get them kind of edited and formatted for tonight. And I think what I'd like to do is maybe get everybody's addresses from Mary, and we can mail another packet to you after tonight. Martha Lyon is the one team member who's not here this evening, so there are some edits to her documents that need to happen. We just couldn't make that happen for this evening. So those are almost ready to go, and you'll see more of these roll out as time goes on. So don't leave without your reading material. So with that, I want to then tell you what this is. We've tried to kind of lay out sort of 5 kind of things that we think are sort of significant to us based on the research that we've done to date. What informs these findings and observations is a combination of the core assessment meetings we did in the fall, interviews that we've had with staff and other folks in town, things that we picked up from the visioning process, but then also just a lot of research. We've looked at gobs of data and tried to kind of understand what's going on here in order to sort of arrive at things that we think are probably important to look at in the master plan. These are not all the findings. They may not even to you be the most important ones, and that's something we're going to want to know. But we are just trying to give you a flavor of where we think this plan kind of needs to go in terms of the issues it needs to look at. So there are kind of 5 findings for each section of the plan. The one section that's not in this presentation is the land use element, and you'll see why in a few minutes, because in almost every one of the other sections, there are findings that relate to land use, that relate to regulatory reform. So rather than get into another whole discussion about zoning, you're going to see zoning and other types of regulation pop up throughout this presentation. So that's, I think with that, I'll go forward.
Judy, just to interrupt right away,
Yes.
Would you like to run through it and then have the committee ask some questions at the end, or do you want us to
That's a very good question.
raise our hands? How do you want to handle
Asked
it?
me to address that, and I totally forgot.
No, that's okay.
We're going to tag team as a team, because I have my colleagues here, and many of these findings came from them. So we'll go through the slides, if you don't mind. Let us go through the slides, because we're going to have different people come up to the microphone. And if you have questions, burning questions, just make a note to yourself, and then we can get to them when the presentation's done, okay? So, you kind of know, I think, from what I said, kind of where we are. We've drafted the vision and goals, so Daphne has done that. With all that input that came, credit to your town for the amazing participation that happened in that process. Unfortunately, what it meant for us was that there was an awful lot of material to go through, but that's really a good problem for a consultant to have, as opposed to scrambling and trying to understand where is this community. We are working on the inventory and assessment reports. They're in various stages of completion. And then also, as you know, we're having these discussion meetings planned. Some of these dates, the later dates may fudge a little bit. I know, Gordon, I think you wanted to maybe talk about the schedule a bit, but this is the architecture of what we're planning to do, even if the dates end up wiggling a bit. We had the transportation and sustainability discussion in January, and what we did at that is basically the same format you're going to see going forward, where we come forth with some questions we want to get some input from you folks on. So the next set is public facilities and housing. That will be coming up on March 18th. After that, the March 25th date I know is really locked in. That's the night that I know we can have Martha here for both of her sections, which is historic, cultural, and natural resources and open space. Then we get to economic development and land use, which we think is probably, those are sort of big topics for this plan. And those will come at some point in May. I've sort of plugged in May 20th here. I think that's the intent, but we can talk about the May dates as we go forward.
Yes.
So that's kind of where we are so far. Want to share with you initial findings. As I said, it's based on our research and so forth. These are not conclusions. I don't want anybody walking out of here tonight and thinking, oh, these consultants have already made up their mind. We've sort of made up our mind about a few things, but there's a lot of things that are really, still up for grabs. It's not a complete set of findings, and they're certainly not recommendations. We're not there yet. So these are kind of things we've seen that we think are important. Many of the slides relate to more than one element. This is probably no surprise to any of you who've been involved in planning projects before. You're going to see some slides that might relate to, say, sustainability, but they relate also to transportation or something else. So we've tried to take the icons that you saw in the core assessment document. We sort of have these little icons in there for each topic. And you'll see on the slides, for example, if a slide is actually in the sustainability section, it may have one or more of those icons on a given slide. That's to cue you that we know this relates to more than one element of the plan. Okay? So with that, I'm going to ask Jeff to talk about the sustainability slides. And I think, you know, the sort of goal is to try to get through these fairly efficiently, which I know you can do. So go for it.
You may consider this too efficient, but remember, we're trying to get through these so that you can have a Q&A at the end. So we had the advantage, of course, of having had our discussion with you all in January already for this chapter, which was very helpful. So the first two major points really are protecting both your natural resources and your infrastructure, your hard infrastructure, from sea level rise and climate change, particularly storm surge and coastal erosion and shoreline change. So first, with natural resources, we're really looking at protecting your ground and surface water, which of course will be at risk as these trends continue. Working to protect your open spaces and forests, which are going to continue to be vulnerable to flooding, storms, and drought. And also a very specific issue that your transfer station, as waters rise, you could have to be dealing with leaching of pollutants as water infiltrates that transfer station. So for all of these, we really are reiterating what we heard from you in January, that you have plans, you've acknowledged where the issues are related to sustainability and climate change and sea level rise, and it's really a matter of aggressively finding those funding sources to implement the plans that you have in place. So identifying backup supplies, emergency supply for water distribution, finding ways to improve tidal flows from Hingham Harbor, and ways to use Beal Cove to absorb more of the floodwaters and sea level rise, so that as it absorbs there, it can protect your other resources. So the flip side of this, on top of the natural environment that's at risk, is the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure, sewer pump, Foster Elementary School, which definitely ties back to the services and facilities piece, which you'll hear more from in a bit. Roadways and rail routes that are at risk, particularly those for emergency access and evacuation, making sure that those are restructured so as not to flood as persistently. And again, you've got the strategies for how to address this. It's really at this point a matter of finding the funding. Achieving energy reduction goals. So there's another one that you've done a lot of work on recently. You've got the Hingham Energy Action Committee actively working for a plan on carbon neutrality, and our charge from the January meeting is to let that group do its work and support them in that. You've also identified where your buildings and your vehicles are consuming the most energy. So again, you've got the data on that, and now it's a matter of implementing energy efficiency measures in those buildings and finding more aggressive ways, I think, to increase the efficiency of your vehicle fleet. And finally, one of the things that came up a lot was just a general education campaign for the town serving by example for residents, for businesses in the community, and demonstrating how they can change their behavior to reduce energy use, which has been shown in other communities to have a significant impact on actions in energy use. So next, expanding policies on renewable energy. This is one thing that we discussed last month, that you don't have explicit policy for accessory solar energy. Like if someone wants a solar mounted on their roof or in their backyard, or a private business wants this. So we really suggest that you look at opportunities to explicitly allow that. You may be missing opportunities. People may be less inclined to install these things because there is no explicit policy. Also encouraging you to look at energy storage facilities and wind energy facilities. Right now, neither of them are mentioned in your bylaw, which means that they are prohibited. Energy storage is a new technology, but there are opportunities for that to help the consistency of the flow of energy within town, and something that should be on the books, both as a standalone and accessory. And then also at least explore the options for onshore and offshore wind. And then finally, we discussed maintaining a healthy and active harbor. We heard from you very loud and clear that consolidating the harbor master facilities isn't a very important priority for you all, but we do see Hingham Harbor and its coastal recreational transportation, economic assets as being really vital to your future, and it's going to be important to keep these healthy. So that includes, as we discussed in the first two slides, your hard infrastructure, the seawalls, the piers, the buffers. Also includes protecting the parks and the beaches that are subject to flooding and erosion, as well as the land-based facilities that help support your boating and ferry services. And again, you've identified the problems, you've got the plans in place. It's a matter of aggressively seeking that funding to increase the height of the seawalls, make those more resilient, make sure that you're making your transportation and recreational assets more resilient, and installing a tide gauge in Hingham Harbor so you can better respond when potential disasters are occurring. So that was my very, very quick, because we got a lot to go over. Again, we'll go over any questions you may have, but I do want to turn it over to Daphne for public facilities and services.
Thank you. So, public facilities and services. Oh, this is too high for me. That's better. So what's the importance of public facilities and services? In a relatively small town such as Hingham, a lot of your facilities, such as the library, the schools, the town hall, recreational facilities, the senior center, those are community gathering spaces. That's where the community comes together. The condition of your facility sends a message to newcomers about how you take care or not of your facilities. The types of services that a municipality provides and its locations send a message about your priorities. Are your priorities about families, about older people? And where you provide services such as water and sewer also sends a message about where you want development to occur or not. Shifts in demographics necessarily affect the expectations regarding the kind of facilities and services that you need to provide to your residents. And maintaining acceptable levels of service and maintaining acceptable maintenance of your facilities is a very important planning and fiscal goal. Oh dear. Sorry about that. So, excellence in education, something this town cares a lot about. The public institutions providing education need updating and upgrading in order to be state of the art. So a lot of people move here, especially for the schools. And the schools are mostly older facilities. They're just at below or just at about capacity. A lot of them don't support new ways of pedagogy, including maker spaces, STEM or STEAM. And so those kinds of spaces are not available. And in addition, according to the superintendent, that there are a lot of other types of spaces that are not available because of the way the schools have had to kind of reallocate space. So certain types of tutoring and psychological support. The library, more than half of Hingham's residents hold library cards, which is a pretty high percentage of the population. And there's a big demand for additional programming, and libraries have becoming now more and more a community center, and the library would like to, but doesn't have the spaces in order to do so. So, Foster School is the #1 school that needs attention, because by 2030, it's expected that the flooding will be so significant that it will no longer be available for teaching. So that's the #1, but the other schools will need attention in terms of the kinds of spaces that I spoke about. And the role of the library, again, in order for it to provide the kinds of programming that people are asking for all ages, it will need that support. So opportunities is to relocate the Foster School out of the flood zone, update the schools, and support the library in its plans. So, meeting the needs of older adults. Most older adults have lived in Hingham for many years, and many of them in various studies have reported being committed to staying in Hingham as they grow older, which is not, it's not the case everywhere. So there is, and simultaneously, while there's a large increase and projected continued increase in the population of older adults, only 14% actually use the senior center. So that's something to consider. There are various hypotheses as to why that number is so low. So Hingham has the highest percentage of people over 65 in the South Shore, and increasing really significantly. But space and parking are inadequate. Baby boomers have a very different expectation regarding aging and regarding the kinds of activities that they would like. They tend much more to be interested in intergenerational activities and not to be kind of branded as seniors. So it might be that it's an opportunity, if the senior center is to expand to accommodate this rise in the population, to rebrand it. To rebrand it as a community center where there will be natural opportunities for intergenerational activities, or to rebrand it as not a kind of isolated, only for that demographic kind of place. And of course, an increase in transportation, health, wellness, and fitness services are really what all the new kinds of services that are being provided to the baby boomer population. And co-programming is another way to expand the capacity. If you program with a recreational department, with the schools, with the library, there are other locations, so it's not this isolated place, but also increases capacity at the same time. Public services and safety. So, sorry about that. There we go. So old, outdated facilities and changing demographics and significant increases in development have resulted in a need to upgrade these facilities. The number of calls for service have been increasing steadily, both in the police and the fire. A lot of the increase in those services, the calls for service, are related to the aging population. So there's been an increase, for example, in scams targeting seniors, driving concerns regarding older adults, isolation of seniors falling, and of course, health-related. So that puts an additional pressure on the public safety as a service, but the facilities themselves have also become outdated. The fire stations, all three, were originally built in 1941. Not that they haven't been renovated and added onto since, but the original structures are not up to date, and they do not hold all of the kinds of support for the fire station. The way the town has developed may mean that in the future, especially fire station number 2, may need to be relocated in order for the response times to be within the expected industry standard. So, and the police department also has been finding itself not adequately supported. There are certain tasks that it cannot perform. There's no privacy. The public access to some of the records is awkward. There's not enough office space. So that also would require in the future some relocation. Public utilities, including sewer, water, and electricity, need to be maintained and expanded to support increasing development. As I said earlier, where those are provided is really the direction that you want growth to go in or not. That's really a very important way that you can send a message as to where you want growth to occur. The sewage treatment facility in Hull is at peak capacity. That's something that will be important to renegotiate and consider other ways of expanding capacity. There's a 5-year plan to reduce infiltration and inflow into the system that will also help to increase capacity, but not significantly enough to support a big increase in development. And 6 to 8 of the sewer pumping stations are considered vulnerable to sea level rise, so they may need to be relocated. So these are all capital expenditures that you need to take care of in the near future in order to just support your existing capacity. And of course, Aquarian Water has recently purchased the water system, and they have been systematically working on a water quality and supply plan. The municipal light is also looking to increase capacity in order to reach the goals for reducing carbon footprint, as well as increase in expected electrical cars and electrical buses. Capital planning. So as the town has grown, so has the need to formalize and make the process of capital planning and deferred maintenance more systematic. So what does that mean? Usually small towns are able to get by making decisions in a more casual, less transparent, if you will, way, because there's no need to sort of make a very explicit list of priorities, explicit list of criteria as to how capital planning decisions are made. But as towns grow, that becomes much more important. So there are ways to kind of professionalize the process and make it more systematic that the town will need to consider. And those include developing the criteria and making them explicit for prioritizing the capital expenditures, hiring full-time facilities manager, having a committee that's dedicated to this, and preparing a town-wide facilities master plan. Those are some of the things to consider as a way of formalizing the process. So.
So as I mentioned, Martha's not here this evening, and I'll just walk you through her findings and kind of the basis for them and some ideas that she has provided. So just to be clear, the statement of finding is always in that bold type at the top. So the first finding for historic and cultural is that you've established 7 historic districts covering approximately 700 homes, commercial and civic structures and landscapes. And your scenic roads bylaw has designated 8 routes, yet many historic resources remain threatened. And the basis for that finding is that the historic district covers just 10% of the historic buildings, and scenic roads bylaw has protected a very small fraction of the roads that are most likely eligible. So some opportunities for the town to consider to address this type of finding would be to create additional local historic districts, of course, and protect a greater portion of your historic resources. To provide education programs to new homeowners about the value of preserving their historic property, and involving children in this effort as well. Amending the scenic roads bylaw to include more stringent criteria relating to removal of historic stone walls and trees and other natural and man-made features, and to designate additional roads through the scenic roads bylaw. This item is going to come up in the housing piece as well. These are very kind of inextricably tied together. Hingham has a scarcity of smaller-sized historic homes desired by residents who want to remain in town, but wish to downsize. Since the demolition delay bylaw was enacted in the late 1980s, the town has lost roughly half of the buildings reviewed under the bylaw after the 6-month delay is imposed. The short 6-month delay has allowed property owners to simply wait out the delay period and proceed with demolition. And many smaller homes have been replaced by much larger ones. You may live in neighborhoods where you've seen some of this occur. Some opportunities for the town to consider, if it wants to address this situation, would be to extend the delay period to a maximum of 2 years. This is kind of the trend, just so you know, in other communities that have demolition delay, is to extend that period longer in hopes of incentivizing some preservation, where currently 6 months just isn't doing it, especially in a very strong market like yours. Providing financial incentives to developers who restore historic properties as affordable housing, such as Nantucket has done. Or providing financial incentives to first-time owners of small historic homes to restore rather than replace their properties. Incompatible changes to neighborhoods. Current zoning, specifically lot coverage, allows property owners to build homes that are out of scale with their neighborhood. This is directly related to the previous finding. Existing lot coverages have resulted in densities that conflict with traditional neighborhood patterns, altering historic character. Some opportunities to address this, if you choose, would be to amend your existing zoning with redefining lot coverage that more accurately reflects the traditional patterns in the neighborhoods, or creating overlay districts in areas where historic homes remain to preserve historic lot coverages and traditional patterns. Entrances to Hingham. Gateways into Hingham from the north, east, and south lack clear definition and do not clearly convey to visitors a sense of arrival. Entrances from neighboring towns lack consistent signage, plantings, lighting, and other landscape amenities that reflect the character of Hingham and welcome visitors to the town. Many communities are working on this kind of gateway sort of treatments to sort of say, you've arrived in our community, and that doesn't really exist here. Some opportunities to address this, if you choose, would be to work with your neighboring communities as opportunities arise to upgrade sort of shared intersections, such as Queen Anne's Corner, or to develop and implement a signage and landscape plan that can be applied to all major entrances. And preservation of town records. I should tell you this comes up in almost every master plan I work on now. This is not just Hingham. The town lacks a comprehensive catalog of historic town records, as well as a facility and system for storing them. Town records are not currently maintained by one entity, and each department has developed its own approach to saving, storing, and preserving records. Neither the library nor the town hall has the capacity to adequately and safely store them. Some opportunities to address this, if you choose, would be to create a system to archive records, both manually and electronically, have an accessioning policy and implement it, building a facility for storing records, or hiring a professional archivist to catalog and maintain records, as many communities in Massachusetts have done in the last few years. So those are the findings on historic and cultural resources. Now I'll look at natural resources and open space, which is also Martha's contribution to the plan. As you can see, this relates to several other elements, including land use and sustainability and town government and public facilities. Residents and key stakeholders have expressed concern about water quality and quantity, including the need to conserve water in a more proactive way. The basis for that finding is that groundwater recharged by Accord Brook supplies much of the town with drinking water, and while the town has taken steps to protect the Accord Brook watershed, supply is not unlimited. The town has not placed restrictions on the watering of lawns. Some opportunities to address this, if you choose, to update and strengthen the regulations associated with the existing watershed protection district, or to regulate the watering of lawns to promote water conservation. Management of existing open space. The cost of purchasing open space in Hingham is very high, and management of open space is an additional cost. Hingham contains more than 4,000 acres of protected open space through ownership and easement held by the town and land trusts. A total of 9 entities of town government, including departments, trustees, and partnerships, manage 2,800 acres of town-owned open space and recreation land. The degree to which this open space is managed varies depending upon the resources of the owner. Some opportunities to address this might be to require that funds to manage open space acquisitions accompany all future gifts of open space land. Also, to explore alternative approaches to land management, such as forming friends groups or open space cooperatives. And third, to consolidate and streamline the management of town-owned open space and recreation land. Open space and recreation site connectivity. Many of Hingham's open space parcels and recreation areas are disconnected, making it hard for users to move between multiple sites on a single recreation outing. Connections can also serve, of course, as wildlife corridors. A recently completed comprehensive trail study confirmed that the lack of linkages and identified many opportunities for making connections, which is, of course, a very common and desired goal in any kind of open space framework, is to connect the properties. Opportunities to address this would be to devote more resources to making those connections and to develop a signage program to better identify open space and the connections that actually do exist, so people know where they can go. Needs of recreation fields. The town will need to balance support for expanded, upgraded, and additional recreation fields with the need for more and improved public services, including a library and a new senior center. Hingham recently commissioned a recreation fields assessment to better understand existing conditions and forecast long-term needs. The study is in progress. Opportunities, you're going to need to weigh the recommendations of that assessment with other priorities for improved public facilities. We think this is probably going to be a much larger conversation in your master plan, is around the sort of public facilities and services in the community and how you maintain and sustain what you have, given all the other competing needs the community has. And neighborhood playgrounds. You maintain several public school and neighborhood playgrounds, each with a shelf life of 20 to 30 years. The cost to the town to maintain them is high and, of course, ongoing. Between 2013 and 2019, Community Preservation Committee funded nearly $250,000 to upgrade existing playgrounds and construct new ones at 4 sites. The town operates just one fully compliant playground with the Americans with Disabilities Act, as best we know. Opportunities to address this would be to explore sustainable approaches to constructing playgrounds and playground equipment, or to consider replacing traditional playgrounds with nature-based playgrounds, and then also to enlist the efforts of volunteers to raise funds for playground equipment, again, as many communities have done. So I'm going to stand here because I'm doing this one too. I want to talk a little bit about housing and demographics. You'll get your turn soon. Amy's here for transportation. So I want to start by telling you, I think your town has done more than a lot of communities have done to create affordable housing. Even if people are not always happy with the results, a lot has been done here. And I think that that needs to be recognized. We don't work in a lot of communities that are over the 10% statutory minimum under Chapter 40B. So you exceed that at the moment. You're at 11.37%. You've done some local initiatives to get there, such as Lincoln School and Beale Street. You've committed over $2 million in CPA funding for housing between 2003 and 2018. So those are all good things. There are some other opportunities available to you, especially because you're over that 10% minimum. And one is to take a pretty selective and careful approach and a strategic approach to future affordable housing proposals. You have a degree of control at the moment that perhaps you did not have before. Now you really have an opportunity to address local needs, which many Chapter 40B developments do not. You can consider a comprehensive approach to inclusionary zoning. What that means is zoning that requires or incentivizes developers to provide affordable housing in new development, mixed use, multifamily, and so forth. You have some of that, but we're thinking more about just really kind of a comprehensive look at inclusionary zoning, which many communities are doing now in an effort to try to not lose ground against that 10% minimum once you've surpassed it. And to focus on the housing needs of specific populations, such as older adults. As Daphne mentioned, you have an exceptionally large percentage of older adults living in your community today. People with disabilities. There is a shortage in virtually every community I work in for housing for people with disabilities. And that is, by the way, a companion piece to what's happening with the aging of our population. And then also to kind of look at, maybe housing needs of the local workforce, which is really a sort of important sustainability conversation, which is why that sustainability icon is up there. and other needs that are identified in your housing plan, which isn't done yet, but it's identified a number of things that you're going to want to think about. I mentioned earlier this would come up, so here we are again on the tear down issue. There's market demand and market opportunity for turning existing residential properties into higher value assets, mainly through tear downs. According to data that we received from the town, there have been 54 tear downs between 2017 and 2019. There's also been an uptick in single-family to two-family home conversions. These are all things that people do to enhance the value of their residential property. We always look in towns that have a lot of older housing stock at this concept of a land value ratio. We look at what is the relationship between the value of land and the value of buildings in order to try to identify areas where there may be a heightened risk of tear down. What we tend to find in many communities, and we certainly saw it in your assessor's data here, is that there's a high value, that the land is worth more than the building, and when it's worth a lot more, those types of properties tend to be at risk of being torn down, especially when they're houses that were built between the wars. And I mean between the two world wars, for those of you who wonder which wars I'm talking about. But that 1929 to kind of 70 period, building code changed, a lot of things happened, and those properties often are at risk. So the best we were able to discern was that at minimum 25% of the inventory of housing, single-family homes, built in that period are probably at risk of tear down. So that's a significant impact on neighborhood character. Ask anybody you may know who lives in Lexington, to what has happened with some of the neighborhoods there, to exactly the housing that was built in that period. It's at risk. And what I just want you to know is that a lot of the homes in that period have high land values, higher than the building. So what happens is it becomes an incentive. When you can't get a lot that's vacant, you buy one with an improvement and you tear it down. And you're seeing that already in your community. Some opportunities to think about this, in addition to what Martha had mentioned on her slide, was to revisit lot coverage ratios, to think about a large house review bylaw. There's been mixed experience with that. I don't want to tell you that is just a cure-all. But we have some communities in Massachusetts that have adopted what's called a large house review bylaw. It's basically a bylaw that says if you're building a home over a certain size, you have to come to the planning board for what is sort of like a mini site plan review process. And it really is more like design review, so that you're at least being able to look at the scale and massing of the building when it's going to dwarf small 1.5-story homes around it. But it doesn't ever say you can't build a house over a certain size. It's really more of a design review. So it's a way to try to mitigate the impact of tear down. That's an opportunity you can consider. It's had mixed success in Wellesley and Lincoln and Weston where it already exists. And then thinking about targeted affordable housing buy-downs. And this will be an important thing for your housing trust, if it had money, to be able to acquire some of those older 1929 to 74 homes that are at risk of tear down, to be able to buy those, place an affordable housing restriction on them, and keep them affordable, which could be a real contribution, albeit one unit at a time, toward helping you kind of keep an eye on that 10%. It's not a perfect, it's not the only thing it would do, but it's an opportunity. Despite what you've done here, which is commendable, you have many unaffordably housed people in your community. And what that means is the standard for affordable housing is are you really sort of required to spend more than 30% of your monthly income on housing? So for a homeowner, that's a mortgage, principal and interest, taxes and insurance. For a renter, it's basic rent and basic utilities. So 30%, if you're having to spend more than 30% of your income on housing, you're said to be what we call housing cost burdened. It's significant here, and I need you to just think about this. 44.9% of the people who rent in your community are in some way housing cost burdened. And then in some parts of town, it exceeds 50%. That is those are the largest percentages of housing cost burden I've seen in any town on the South Shore. So it's something you want to think about. Again, now that you have that control of being over 10%, you have the luxury of thinking about, well, what kind of needs do we want to address? And there's a variety of needs, not all of which are about affordability. But when you see statistics like this, it probably is going to want to challenge you to think about, well, what could the Housing Trust do, or how could we be working with developers to get some more deeply affordable units in our community? So focusing future affordable housing initiatives on what we call kind of deeply subsidized lower income rental units, and explore the possibility of using Community Preservation Act funds for a rental assistance program, as the town of Chatham has done for many years, to provide both year-round housing but also affordable housing. You have a housing trust, fortunately for you, and with funding and staff support, it could be an even stronger player in affordable housing, both as a developer, as a housing services provider, as a source of funding, as an advocate. And it does many of those things now. My message to you is, if it wanted to, and if the town wanted it to, it could do even more. And this is a policy decision, so I'm not saying you have to do this. I'm just saying that these are things for you to think about. So based on the data that we've seen, about 9.2% of your CPA funding has been committed to community housing over a period of time. Many towns systematically commit 10% or more. Provincetown commits 90% every year, just because that's a priority issue for them. Short-term rental occupancy tax, which is just now going to start, we're seeing the effect of this, the ability to kind of get some revenue out of short-term rentals such as Airbnb. You can allocate that kind of money to an affordable housing trust. What does a housing trust do if it doesn't have money? It really can't do anything. When it has money, it can do a lot. So thinking about kind of adopting a short-term rental tax, kind of at the maximum you can, and dedicating as much of that as you can to your housing trust, because that would be found revenue. Providing general fund appropriations to the housing trust. Many communities do that, in addition to CPA and whatever. And then also thinking about that inclusionary zoning idea, to be able to perhaps give a developer of perhaps smaller projects the option to pay a fee in lieu, what we call a fee instead of building a unit, and let that revenue go to the housing trust. So you have some options to capitalize your trust. And then this concept of inclusionary zoning. As we said, you have some of this already, but we didn't see a comprehensive approach to it in your zoning. It usually applies to any development over a certain size. It can be town-wide, it can be district-based. Communities have different approaches to this. Requirements can be customized to each zoning district, which makes sense. If you think about it, you have a number of districts already in your town. They allow different amounts of development. They have different requirements for lot size. So you can think about ways in which you can make IZ, or inclusionary zoning, fit within that scheme, if you choose. About 1/3 of the towns in Massachusetts have it, with varying results. Some of these bylaws simply don't work because they're not realistic. Some of them have worked just fine. So opportunities for you to think about would be assembling a kind of a working group to look at the feasibility and design options for inclusionary zoning in your community. Don't take somebody else's bylaw and just run with it, because it never works that way. We need a working group, and you need some developers at the table. Considering options for a fee in lieu that could be paid to the housing trust, and then increasing opportunities to develop multifamily housing and tie inclusionary zoning to some kind of density bonus. That's really when it tends to work the best. I think it's your turn.
All right.
Here you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So transportation was something we heard a lot about in the visioning sessions. We broke it down into 5 major topics. The first is parking. We heard a lot that parking in Hingham Square can be a challenge. You did a parking study, 2 parking studies actually, in 2017 and 2018. Found that Merchants parking lot near Hingham Square is 96% occupied on weekdays. You don't have much enforcement of the on-street parking downtown, so that encourages people to park there all day, especially employees of the businesses downtown, and that makes it hard for customers to come and maybe discourages people from coming and trying to park downtown and visit those businesses. It also encourages parking to spill over from the square into the neighborhood streets. So some opportunities to address this would be to manage the parking and increase turnover by enforcing it or potentially placing time restrictions on it. Revisiting the parking limits would be the time restrictions. You could also identify different areas that employees could park in so that they're not parking on the street right in front of the businesses where customers want to park. There could also be opportunities for shared parking between some businesses and residential. And another thing would be to eliminate the minimum parking requirements for developments. That would be in your bylaws. Potentially, you don't need to require developers to provide 4 to 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. So you could lower the minimums or potentially get rid of them altogether. Another big thing is traffic congestion and traffic safety. There are high crash rates at many of the intersections within Hingham. I know Route 3A at Kilby Street was a particularly high crash location that was identified by the state as being a highway safety improvement program eligible. Route 3 and Derby Street is another high crash location. I know you have a project going on down there now, so hopefully that will help to address that. You have high traffic volume growth really everywhere throughout the town, but mostly on these major roadways, 3A, 53, Derby Street. We're seeing 1 to 5% compound annual growth rates on some of these bigger streets. And also, of course, a lot of the new development in South Hingham, also other areas that adds to the traffic volumes. I know also at the shipyard as well, there's a lot of speeding throughout town. That's something that we've heard as well. So some opportunities would be to complete the 3A road diet that you piloted, complete the MassDOT Derby Street project. I know that's ongoing right now. Just more enforcement of speeding too, that would help with safety. And then, of course, just taking a bigger look at any other intersections where you have safety issues and identifying potential improvements for those, and also potential funding sources through MassDOT. Another big thing was the pedestrian and bicycle safety and connectivity. I know in the square area there are a lot of sidewalks, and that's very nice, but potentially expanding that beyond the square so that it connects other destinations in town. I know pedestrians and bicyclists don't feel comfortable crossing Route 3A. There are also a lot of other roadways that don't have sidewalks, very few bicycle facilities on the roadways as well. And the sidewalks that you do have, some of them need to be repaired or are too narrow. Pedestrian signals and accessible ramps could be upgraded to further enhance the pedestrian accessibility and safety. So some opportunities for that would be to complete a study to evaluate sidewalks, pedestrian signage and crosswalks, developing a pedestrian and bicycle plan to prioritize which areas of town, which connections are desirable for these other modes of transportation, and identify safe routes to school projects eligible for MassDOT funding. 3 of the elementary schools are enrolled in the program, so there's definitely an opportunity to apply for some funding through that. Transit is also a very big thing in Hingham. So you have the 2 train stations, as you know, as well as the ferry. There is a bus service, but unfortunately does not connect those things. I know it stops on 3A near the shipyard, but doesn't go into the shipyard. Also does not stop at either of the commuter rail stations. Then parking demand is increasing at the shipyard and at all of the commuter rail stations, so that could potentially be alleviated by having those bus connections between the stations. Another parking issue is here at Town Hall with the senior and at the senior center. As I'm sure all of you know, the demand for senior center medical vans and shuttle exceeds the capacity and doesn't run on the weekends. It's got a pretty fixed schedule during the week. So an opportunity would be to coordinate with the MBTA to improve some of the service and connections, evaluate the need for a townwide shuttle service, and then also to look at funding opportunities through the state for different types of transit programs. Transportation demand management will become really important as development continues in Hingham, especially in South Hingham right now. It's a really big thing that obviously you know that traffic is going to increase the more you develop. So currently you have a traffic safety infrastructure improvement fund in the South Hingham overlay district, but there are no TDM requirements. So developers, they have to pay money into this fund, but they don't necessarily have to do anything specifically to mitigate the traffic that they're creating. So some opportunities would be to use those funds that you're already collecting in order to mitigate that, and then also to develop TDM regulations and thresholds as part of your bylaws for this new development. All right, economic development.
I've had to be up here too much. Don't shoot the messenger. Economic development, this is the last set of slides, and then we can talk. So in an economic development element, people often think that all you're looking at is how to get more business and more tax revenue, but there's really a much more complicated and interesting topic than that. And actually the first thing we do is look at the characteristics of your labor force, because that has a lot to do with how does money come in and out of your community, and what do people do for work, and what's the relationship between what your residents do for work and the kind of employment base that you have. So we'll just start there. There's kind of, I guess, what I would call diplomatically a less than optimal match between your highly educated labor force and the makeup of your employment base and opportunities to work locally. So when we talk about a strong industry, we don't mean just how many jobs it has. What we do is we look at the structure of your employment base, what percentage of the base is made up of different industries. And we typically compare that to a larger, what we call a reference geography, to get a sense of, are you kind of in sync with your region? Are you really different from your region? Are you different from the state? Does it matter? And we do that for a couple of reasons. First, to try to understand, are there opportunities that exist in your community because you perhaps have an underrepresented industry that's very strong in your region? Or we also look at it to say, do you have industries here that are really potent part of your employment base that are actually providing jobs way beyond what the town's need is, which of course is fine, but you try to understand, do you have what are the opportunities for employment-based growth? I guess that's really what the question is. So to arrive at that, we compute what's called a location quotient. And it's that comparison of the structure of the local base to the structure of a reference economy, which in this case would be the Boston metro area, because you're part of that labor market. So given that, just think about location quotients. Your strongest industries are construction trades, retail, finance, insurance, arts and entertainment, management of companies and enterprises, which is basically an industry that's about holding companies, and to a lesser extent, professional services. Your location quotient for professional services is barely 1. So 1 is equilibrium. When you have a location quotient of 2, 3, or 4, that's a really strong industry. It almost gets to the point of being a company town. And if you have a location quotient that's 0.8, 0.7, 0.6, below 1, that's kind of an underrepresented industry in your town relative to your labor market area. So that's what the employment base looks like. But your residents work in information, in finance and real estate, and professional services. There are much stronger ratios in those industries than what you have in your local employment base. So most of the local job growth that's actually happening here is tending to happen in lower wage employment. I don't think that's any big surprise, but that's what's happened. And part of it is, you have a number of retail outlets here. There's an imbalance between the jobs that are in your community and the wage and employment needs of the household. So even though you have some industries where you have a high location quotient, they're not necessarily high wage industries. So that contributes to people needing to leave town every day to go to a job somewhere else in order to be able to support what it costs to live in the town of Hingham. Residents with the highest wage and salary earnings in your community are people who commute by public transportation. I don't think that's actually a big surprise, but we do see this fairly often, and I think it's worth pointing out to people. The value of having public transportation in your community is that it opens up opportunities for people to seek out higher wage employment in places like Boston and Cambridge. Just a little tidbit that I thought you might appreciate. So some opportunities to think about in terms if you're concerned at all about that imbalance, which is there, it's measurable, is to sort of think about your economic development strategies to have a better alignment between the types of jobs that are in your community and what the labor force does for a living and what kinds of industries people are actually skilled to work in. You have a highly educated labor force. It's no surprise that they work in those industries, but the actual number of opportunities for them in Hingham is not as great as it is in lower wage employment. And then to think about, too, facilitating what we call collaborative workspaces for self-employed and home-based workers. You do have a fairly significant percentage of people who work at home all or a portion of the work week here. That's not uncommon in affluent communities where you just tend to have a well-educated population. But to sort of think about then what are the needs of those people and how do you serve them in your own community so they don't end up growing their business to the point that they can't work at home anymore, so they go open an office in some other town, but keeping them in your community and serving them. Excuse me. There's potential for economic growth in South Hingham. I don't think this is any surprise to anybody. Local planning has been done, and one of the planning board's master plan goals that were adopted a couple of years ago are to encourage high-quality commercial and mixed-use development in South Hingham and the Shipyard. From all that we heard, from all the interviews and all the conversations we had, and it certainly even came out of the public meetings, it seems like little has happened since that South Hingham Study Group report was released. There's a need for sewer in South Hingham, and it just seems that it has not really been resolved. There are public safety challenges as well. Daphne mentioned the old fire station, but just generally serving that part of town is a challenge. Master planning has been done to reposition the South Shore Park as a mixed-use office industrial center with housing, retail, and services. This is sort of where kind of the reactivation of office parks is going. It's this mixed use. It's having a population that's sort of built, a resident population built in, so that you have enough people there to support really almost like a mini economy. Opportunities to think about would be to recognize South Hingham as a critical direction that we need for the master plan. We're not going to make that decision, but we need you to make it, so we know what you want to say in your plan about the future of South Hingham. Work with the South Shore Chamber to facilitate consensus and determine a path forward for infrastructure, for transportation, and regulatory reform in South Hingham. And collaborate with neighboring Rockland to achieve maybe some mutual benefits. There are opportunities here to think about your neighboring towns and how you might be able to work together for everybody to have, you know, a sort of uplift in your economy. But clearly this is an important issue, and we're going to need direction from your committee as to what the plan needs to say about this. When it comes to the permitting process, Hingham is not regarded as a business-friendly town. We heard this a fair amount, too. We heard the following types of complaints. Slow and unpredictable process, town has high but unrealistic expectations, and boards listen too much to residents. Now, I'm not here to say that's the case. I'm just telling you what we heard. The zoning, this I can tell you. This is definitely my opinion. The zoning in your town is sometimes convoluted. It's kind of difficult to follow sometimes, and it's in some places not well written, so it's unclear. You have a lot of opportunities to deal with a regulatory framework that makes sense for everybody, where there's some predictability for people who want to develop in your community. They'll know what it kind of takes to get a yes, and if they can't get a yes, they'll go somewhere else or they'll do some other kind of project. But also for neighborhoods and abutters to understand what can happen. The clearer the regulations are, actually it's just better for everybody. So reviewing the division of responsibilities for shared or overlapping jurisdiction, you know, have some focus groups, so some developers, attorneys, and engineers kind of work here, so you can understand their experiences, kind of a permitting self-assessment process. I will be the first to tell you that, yes, most developers will come and complain at a session like that. If you let them complain for 15 minutes and then you start to listen for the substance, you might learn something. And it might be very helpful to you to have that kind of engagement with the people who actually build in your community. Do kind of a survey of best practices in permitting. I think if you do that and you compare that with the framework you have, you'll see some opportunities to do things better. Considering options to streamline or consolidate permitting and joint hearings and things like that, where it makes sense to do so. Looking at your administrative rules and regs, your applications and procedures from an applicant's perspective. This is one of the things I see so often in work I do in communities, is that what the application form says and what the regulations say and the decision criteria are not, they're just not aligned. So an applicant puts in an application thinking they know what you want, they get to a hearing and the board starts asking questions about, well, we would like to see X, Y, and Z, and the applicant has no idea. Because there's a misalignment between what is communicated to the applicant about what the board needs and what the bylaw says and what the applicant thinks is going on. So the more that documentation is consistent, you'd be amazed at how that can reduce communication problems. And then updating the zoning bylaw, which I'm sure you all know kind of needs to happen here. Downtown Hingham, so one commenter at a meeting, I think it was the Economic Development Core Assessment meeting, said downtown Hingham is nice, but it isn't extraordinary. It's attractive, it's got historic charm, it's got kind of a walkable design, it's really lovely. I mean, I say that as a resident of the South Shore as much as anything else, it's very pretty. But there's this limited and fragmented kind of connectivity to the waterfront. There's a perceived shortage of parking. I say perceived because, the state of the art in planning today is not to set minimum parking requirements, but rather to set maximum or simply no parking requirements at all and let the market solve it. Don't have a heart attack, but that in fact is the state of the art. And then there are high rents in the build, so that sort of relates to the ability of a small traditional downtown establishment to survive. I did look at the rents. We heard this, from a couple of people, and so I went and did some research on the rents in the buildings there, and they're high. And I don't know how much that has created problems for people, but we heard it. And then how much housing should be encouraged or even allowed? I think this is a big question where you're looking at a downtown where there's a potential for mixed-use development. So some opportunities, is kind of a work on this downtown Hingham Harbor master plan, which with MAPC, which Mary, I think is forthcoming. Is that?
We found out today it was funded.
Okay, great. So you're going to have that opportunity. Resisting the temptation to overregulate commercial space. I can't underscore this enough. We've actually done a fair amount of research on this with communities that we work with. And I hear this often that, well, we're getting too much housing and not enough commercial space. The issue isn't regulating the percentage of commercial space in the building. It's making sure that the commercial space is where you want it. And there are ways to do that can be very clear in the bylaw without sort of setting an expectation for something that may in the market actually be unrealistic. So be careful when you start regulating commercial space in a mixed-use building, that you don't set up a situation where you have unanticipated and unwanted consequences, which is no mixed use at all. And then thinking about a parking management plan for the downtown area. Very often when we hear about parking complaints, it's really a management problem more than a supply problem. And I'm not prepared to say that that's the case here. I'm just telling you that more often than not, that's what we see, that they're just basic parking management issues that need to be addressed. And it's very hard to do that when you're trying to also satisfy local customers and local businesses whose employees want to park near the business. Long-term trends in retail development. This is our last slide. You're going to be so grateful. We're done. Hingham has 2 significant retail centers with national brands, but retail's under pressure everywhere, as you probably know. I don't know how many of you get Amazon boxes at your house every week. I usually get a few. It has changed the way I shop, maybe not the rest of you, but it certainly has for me. Thinking about what's going on even around you, there's sort of evidence right before our eyes about what's kind of happening with retail developments that are being reinvented. Certainly the Hanover Mall is an example. There are other changes happening around you. The potential for Chapter 40R at Queen Anne's Corner. Weymouth is planning to catalyze investment on Bridge Street. They're now doing a study of Jackson Square. So, there's conversations happening around you about how do we activate and revitalize these places. So some opportunities to be thinking about. Be alert to the transformation of retail centers to mixed-use developments and their potential impact on your own local economy. Redevelopment, intensification of use, and mix of uses in South Hingham, and further concentration of housing near the shipyard. And consider options for form-based code over traditional zoning, especially in South Hingham, as a strategy to facilitate market-driven development. Those are opportunities, not necessarily recommendations. That, folks, I can't believe we got through that fast. So we'll take any questions or discussion you want to have about these. I'll just point out, for folks who are here who are not on the committee, if you have comments, Gordon, you may be overstepping my bounds here, but we have a board back there and some Post-it notes, and so if you have comments that you want to commit to us or to the committee, you can put them up on that board. There's paper there to do that, but I think I turn it over to you now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Judy. Yeah, so, for those folks in the audience that may have come in after I had made some initial remarks, we intentionally made this meeting open to the public and televised it because while these are, and just for clarification for those people that came in a little bit late, these are draft initial findings from the consultants to the committee. So we're seeing this for the first time as well, and we're going to have some conversation with the consultants and do some digesting and take it as we go forward. Having said that, from the beginning, we've wanted to have make sure that the public was able to participate. We can't get really into a dialogue either between you folks in the committee or you folks in the consultants at this point because we have to work through this. But if you do have comments, the board is there. And as always, the comment public comments available on the master plan webpage on the town website. So if you want to go back and look at the video of this afterwards and digest it and make a comment online, we take them all in, and we'll consider them all. So with that, I think let's try and spend 40 minutes or so probably from the committee. If there are any comments or feedback on what we just went through, I'm inclined to start at the end and work backwards, risking that we might spend an awful lot of time on some of those last few slides, but I'm open to suggestions if that's all right with everybody, or do you want to go to the beginning and work down? Thoughts?
If we could go slide by slide, whichever direction.
No, I don't want to go slide by slide. I just want to go subject matter by subject matter. If there are comments on economic development, we'll kind of work our way through that. And then we'll go from there. Yeah, no, there was certainly a lot there. My expectation is that there's going to be even more questions and comments after you've had a chance to digest it, and we're obviously going to dive into this a lot more when we get into the meetings in March and in May. But why don't we just take the economic development section first, since it's freshest on mind, and see if folks have any particular questions, comments, agreements, disagreements.
I actually had a question, sorry, a question about the location quotient.
Yes.
How does Hingham compare to what we would consider the benchmark towns?
I haven't run location quotients for those towns. I can do it for you.
Okay.
I mean,
think-
I won't do it for 25 towns, but,
No,
you know, we can
but,
look at,
there are certainly
Yeah.
peer towns that you've referenced when you're talking to us.
yes.
I think that would be
I
helpful.
think that'd be
we
helpful.
can do
Thank
that.
you.
Jerry, and use the microphone for me, will you, just for the,
So I'm
friends
just
at home?
wondering, these are topics with bullet points, and I'm wondering, I've got a bunch of kind of minor comments on them, but how will these bullet points and topics be ultimately used? In other words, are we going to have a session for each one of these and really drill down and say, and start to rank importance? Are we just kind of looking for minor tweaks? What is the process going forward, and what will it result in on a topic-by-topic basis?
I'll start, then I'm going to throw it over to Judy. I think the idea here is that this is the consultant's first cut to us, and this is basically the framework. When we sit down for economic development, for example, we will either tackle some of these bullet points, the opportunities. As Judy said, they're not recommendations at this stage. We may choose as a committee to dispense with a number of them on our own. There may be a number in here that are priorities of that are not in here that are priorities of ours. So this is, I think, designed to be the framework for those broader discussions of
Yes.
the committee. And we have, I'm sure, varying opinions around the table on several of these. So that will be the robust discussion that we're going to get to. But we thought it was important that that the committee have a starting point, some framework, rather than just saying, let's talk economic development and see where we ended up. So I think that was the primary purpose of this.
You're going to see some of this in the discussion questions we bring to you. Like at the meeting you had in January when we brought you some transportation questions and sustainability questions, and you got to put red dots up for things that you didn't like. You're going to see these findings kind of turned around into sort of questions where we're trying to elicit some feedback from you.
Got it.
So that we can develop the
Yeah,
recommendations.
exactly, yeah.
Bob?
I have a question in process as well. It seems to me that this might be a good point to identify the priorities of discussion, because not all of these subjects will be weighted in the same way, and some of them are going to take a lot more time than others. And I'm wondering if it shouldn't be appropriate for the committee to vote, or however committees do such things. Consensus does not work and doesn't lead the leadership. So from my perspective, I think if we ranked the subjects by importance in the basis of this committee's thoughts, because some of these could take numerous meetings of discussion, and some are just going to disappear into the mist of confusion. So is there some way we should do that or could do that?
So I think, as I've expressed at a few of these meetings, yeah, these are going to take some talking. These are going to take some conversations among the committee. That's why I've been a little bit concerned about the calendar, to be honest. And I am less confident than you are that there are certain items in here that we'll be able to dispense with quickly, right? I think there's a lot. They're all, I mean, I won't speak for the entire committee, but there's some important stuff on almost every one of those slides, right? If we're going to think about the town today and the town 15 years from now. So I'm not ready to make that surgical decision on what we're going to tackle. I do think that once we get to, let's say, the Housing and Public Facilities meeting on March 18th, that by that time you all have had a chance to digest this stuff. You would have been able to get comments back to Mary and to me and to the consultants on those things that you think are most important in those categories for us to tackle when we get together for that session, right? And I think that'll help us narrow that conversation that evening. We still may not get to everything, which is why later in the agenda we're going to talk about possibly putting a placeholder for a follow-up meeting to do some catch-up on things we don't get to. But I do hope that coming away from this, you all will spend some time thinking about, okay, I want to make sure we do this, this, and this on March 18th. And hopefully that will help us kind of distill it down and be able to get through those. That's my take, but this is.
Because the only reason I brought that up, there are things in this that you've brought up that have nearly $1 billion worth of implications. And then you have things that have maybe $20,000, $30,000 implications. And I'm thinking particularly of things like higher tides, storm-driven tides. That has a huge number attached to it. And we have to, if we're going to make recommendations to the town, we have to fall within some reason of what's achievable and what isn't. And I just have the budget side of this thing is either going to be realistic or we're just going to tax all of our residents to their maximum capability.
One of the things that we do in the master plan is phase those expenditures, phase the recommendations. And that's another thing that we would discuss with you. And that's part of the prioritization process. What do we need to do first? What do we need to do first 5 years, second 5 years, last 10 years?
We're only dealing with 50 years here, folks. I'm well over 50 years, and I can tell you, that's no time at all.
Right.
And when you have some of the budget issues that we're going to face.
No, I think that's right, but I also don't think that as a committee we're going to get to the point of specific budgetary recommendations. There are going to be many of these things where we're raising the exact issue that you are, which is this is a big thing, right? And that we as a community are going to have to spend some time making those assessments. I'm not going to use the word trade-offs too often, but that we're going to put those on the table, that there are, not a lot, but there may be some binary choices, but there are certainly things that we're going to have to prioritize, we're going to have to phase, we might have to do all.
That's what
I have enormous confidence in everybody around this table. We're not going to be able to make those specific recommendations on all of those things. There are going to be some that we're going to be putting on the table for broader and deeper discussions by the town on those specifically. We just don't have the bandwidth, I don't think, to do that. So, yeah, there are going to be some big numbers, but at the same time, just because it's $20,000, $30,000, I don't think we're going to just green light it, immediately and move on, right? Because there are implications of those things.
All right, but when we get to these things, they're going to be in the plan,
Yes.
and the plan's for 50 years. I'm just reminding everybody.
We'll be doing one of these things before 50 years.
Oh, yeah.
I won't, but somebody will. Yes, we're really in a 15 or 20-year window.
I mean, the real implementation schedule that you can bank on is about 10 years, and you end up having to
Yeah,
revisit
then the world
it.
starts to change again.
That's
But,
right.
So,
I guess my thought, I'm sorry to monopolize a little bit here, but my thought is kind of following up on what we did the last time, where we did the red dots, and as a committee, it was a nice way to kind of at least hone in a little bit more on the things that we as a committee seem to think were more important, perhaps contrasted with those that were less important. So, I don't know, it feels like rather than going through several pages per topic here and just, kind of nitpicking little bits here and there, doesn't it make more sense to treat them like we did the last one on a topic-by-topic basis so that we can then kind of hone it down and have a more detailed discussion on a smaller quantity?
Yeah, I think that is what I'm hoping we can do with each of these, so that if there are, this is really big picture stuff, things that you think are glaringly omitted from the economic development section, for example, or things you take strong issue with, or things that you think are exceptionally important, and then we'll move on. We're going to probably do them in 10-minute slots at this point, given the clock. So.
And just a reminder that there is a schedule of meetings that do exactly what you suggest.
Right. That's why we put the schedule up there, because these discussion meetings will be going forward.
Liza?
Thank you.
Sorry.
On the slide related to permit process, and you talk about that the zoning bylaws should be redone to make it more understandable. I appreciate that. You also say in here about how developers feel that citizens here are too much listened to. I think that it would be more appropriate, considering how active our community is with volunteers and with open town meeting, that we emphasize educating, doing a focus group for citizens of their experience with the zoning bylaws, and having an opportunity to educate neighbors, you said about making it clearer. And then I'd also like to see enforcement be put in here as far as review of everything, and whether we are enforcing or not, from both the citizens' viewpoint of projects affecting them or the business owner. So that's my answer.
That's fair. Thank you.
Yep.
And as an elected member of the planning board, I will strenuously disagree that we listen to residents too much, but that's
I didn't.
No, I know, I'm just saying that for the record and for the slide. Yeah.
They brought it up.
Yeah, no, and then also related, while I have the floor, on the downtown Hingham slide, right? So you did have a commenter who said it was ordinary. I would say that certainly from the survey results that I've seen and the visioning statements that I've seen, the vast majority of the folks that participated in that session feel very differently about downtown, right? And think
It's one of the two top places they appreciate the most.
Yes,
But
so.
they do have the concerns about improving it.
Of course, yes, no, I'm not saying
I don't think she
but-
said it was ordinary, I think she said it wasn't extraordinary.
Right, okay, so
I mean,
that'll be the extra meeting we schedule for the semantics, but,
It's nice. We'll just leave it.
other thoughts on economic development?
Can I ask one question
Yeah,
really quick? And this might go toward a couple of different things, but there didn't seem to be a lot of discussion here about pedestrian safety. And did that come up at all, or?
Yeah, that was one of
A
the
lot?
slides.
Yeah.
And it was,
Oh, yeah.
I saw it like a little bit, but it seems like it actually fits into almost every single one of these, right?
It definitely
Topics that we have.
Yeah.
Okay.
so she had a slide on it.
I did see, I did see that slide, but what I'm saying is like, that seems to be an overall theme for,
That's why we had the icons up there, which we probably should have been pointing out more,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
that's exactly why we had those up there, because some of these things just cut across all the master plan elements.
and I just feel like at the visioning sessions that we had, that was such a big topic.
was.
Yep,
It really
you're correct.
So are you-
Across, like
so
across
are you
demographic.
suggesting that we kind of treat it as a theme?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I have one more thing, going back to the zoning comment. I think it's more than zoning, and it's a little misleading to use that specific word, because we have a lot of regulatory bodies in town.
Yes, you do.
Obviously zoning, planning board, historic districts, board of health, sewer commission. And perhaps it would be a little bit more fair to simply call it the regulatory process is perceived as ... because it is far more than just a zoning bylaw.
That's fair. Yep. No.
The concepts are more, better appreciated if I know what they meant. A form-based code over traditional zoning. What are you saying there?
So form-based code is an approach to zoning that concentrates on the form of development, the physical design, the design of development, the physical space occupied by development, and less on land use. So traditional zoning is, here's a use district. And within this district, you can do these uses. And you can do this much because we also have this dimensional table. Where a true form-based code doesn't even pay attention to use. What it does is it regulates the form of development. And the concept is, if you think about the buildings in your community that people love, often they're buildings that are used today for purposes that were not their original intent. And so there are things about buildings that simply endure, and why not think about the physical form of development in your community over getting overly prescriptive about use. That sometimes the overly prescriptive approach about use is why we end up with properties that are not really marketable for their zoned purpose.
So for example,
It's very clear, actually.
for example, that building right there was used to sell hats and caps.
Yeah.
In, I don't know what year. And now it might be used as a dental office. And does it really matter for the passerby whether it's selling hats or cavity filling? It really is about the experience.
It's about how close is it to the street? What's the experience of the pedestrian walking by it? What's the massing of that building? So it focuses more on, I guess, there's just the easiest way I can explain it is it focuses more on the physical design of development than on land use per se.
The look and the feel.
Yep.
Well, I think.
So it's a very common approach in things like a downtown.
Where? In the Commonwealth?
Situate has adopted a form-based code.
Increasingly in
Yeah,
Connecticut.
Cohasset has sort of a form-based code for their village area. It's now a form-based approach.
And some of them aren't, completely.
Yeah, they're not, they're often,
Real estate and banks in their village.
huh?
A lot of real estate and banks in their village.
Yeah, I understand that.
You also talked about the idea of eliminating any kind of parking requirement associated with any kind of.
I'm just saying the state of the art in planning is let the market figure it out.
And we're talking about
that?
that future, right, with automated.
Planning.
Where is that?
Huh?
Where is that state-of-the-art applied? I feel more comfortable when I look at how it's actually working out, as opposed to having some kind of conceptual conversation.
What really it's all about is not requiring every single property to have to chew up part of their land for parking. That the real approach is that it becomes it's a public issue, and so when you organize public parking, you make it possible for people to have a more valuable piece of real estate, because now they're not chewing up part of their lot for pavement.
Except in the square, there aren't a great deal of parking spaces
Right.
except on the public street.
Right.
So how do you
Right.
reconcile that reality?
Have you been to downtown Plymouth? They've gotten
Only
rid
when I
of
have to.
minimum parking requirements on Court Street and Main Street.
They also have meters.
Sure, there's a whole management, that's what I said about parking management. It's a bigger issue than just how many parking spaces do you require? It's how do you manage the supply? I mean, the radical approach, and I don't want to take you down this path too far, but the radical approach is what Plymouth has done. They actually have a parking authority that manages the entire public parking supply in downtown Plymouth. So they sell stickers for residents, they have stickers for businesses, there are satellite lots for employees. It's a whole management structure, and that entity is taking care of it. That's how they ended up amassing enough money to build a parking garage.
One other option we've been exploring in Jamestown, Rhode Island, which is very similar, small downtown, limited amount of space, is a no net loss of parking policy, where we acknowledge that new business coming in isn't going to be able to contribute additional parking spots. So as long as you are doing something that does not decrease the net parking within the downtown area, you're okay.
Needham has something like that.
They do.
Yeah,
I work in Needham.
yeah, okay, so you know the Needham story. I mean, Needham completely revamped their approach to parking about 10 years ago.
I'm not trying to cut it off, I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock, though. Other thoughts on economic development? I want to move on to transportation, if there's anything now. And this is, of course, not your only chance, right? This is your first opportunity to digest the information from the consultants. We're hoping to hear from you between now and the meetings to help us prioritize the details in here. Leslie?
One minor thing, I think we should have an crossover with historic, because some of the roads are scenic roads. And so, for example, in slide 38, where you say several roadways have no sidewalks and bicycle facilities, Martin's Lane. Well, Martin's Lane was deemed a scenic road.
Yep.
And I live there, we wanted sidewalks. It got past the scenic road, we didn't have a chance to comment. But then also, yeah, so there are other roads in town that I'm sure people would want sidewalks on, but they're already scenic roads. So I think we need to make sure that that is the
Every
cross.
street in Lincoln is a scenic road. And Lincoln has the most extensive walking path system and sidewalks of any community in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Well, then maybe it's our zoning laws.
Just want to make that point. You can walk from one end of Lincoln to the other.
How old is the
And never,
system?
oh, they've built it over time. Some of it's old, it's a good question to ask, but they've improved it, they actually rebuilt a significant portion of the walkway system down Bedford Road when they redid that street a few years ago. So it's not a blanket prohibition against sidewalks when you have a scenic road.
No, but it,
I'm not, maybe in Hingham it is, so that's something we
That's
should
fine.
look at to make sure we're,
Yep.
got everything.
yeah, and we've talked about this a bit. When we get into the meat of this in the meetings, if there are genuine examples that are defensible examples for you of peer communities that we could learn from, I think that's very helpful, because
Yeah.
to Paul's point, I want to see it, in some of these
We
things.
can
So
bring you some form-based code example. You'll love them. Form-based code, you'll love it. Make your job much easier.
Transportation? Other thoughts on transportation?
Gordon, on slide 38, where it says complete the ongoing study to evaluate sidewalk signage and crossroads, what is the ongoing study? Who has responsibility for that today in town? And where is that in the process? Is that halfway, just started, almost done? Been on for
I don't know off the
years?
top of my head. We can find out. I don't know.
Yeah, we can look, we were just told it was ongoing, but we can look into the exact status of it.
And the traffic, the improvement fund for South Hingham
Yep.
that was referenced, how large a fund is that? I mean, you say expend funds, I mean, is there
I don't think
material
we have
dollars that are there today?
I don't think we know that, how much money is in it, just we saw that in the bylaw, you do require developers to contribute to it, but we don't
It's a
have-
mitigation, traffic mitigation policy. I don't know how much is,
It was originally funded by Thomas Hastings, 25,000.
wow,
Years ago.
that's a blast from the past. Sorry, I'm old. I mean, some of these names I go,
All right. We know him.
That's right.
so do we, yeah.
Paul got his name out.
Well, that's knowable, though, so I
Sure.
think, to your point.
Sure.
Really is.
Just know that, and put it in here. If
Yeah,
it's
yeah, we can.
25 grand or 100 grand or $1 million, we should simply know what it is today.
We will. Thank you.
I have one minor comment on point number 2, where we're highlighting Route 3A. Most of the comments I heard in the sessions that I went to focused on Main Street as a major kind of traffic congestion issue, so that should be highlighted in there as well.
And related to that, so one of the reasons that Main Street is not necessarily us, right? We've got two towns for which we are the exclusive pass-through, right? So to the extent that you all can do, and again, I don't know what we would do about it, but to know what those growth patterns are in Cohasset and Hull at least, and Situate, just so we can get a sense of what that is. Again, I don't know what we'll do with that, but it is.
Sense of what, Gordon?
The amount of growth in those communities and what their potential contribution to the traffic is, both along Main Street and then, a lot of that boat traffic is not necessarily Hingham residents either. It's a lot of folks that are coming through our town to get to the boat. I just think it would be helpful information for us for context. I would defer to you folks on what we necessarily do with it. But the traffic generation is not exclusively limited to the boundaries of Hingham.
Well, the reason I ask is, obviously with the 3A project, there's been more data collected on the traffic in that corridor supposedly than ever in the history of man. So it does all exist, but I'm not sure what you would do with that information, because traffic flow is traffic flow, regardless of ultimate what town it's going to, if you're worrying about congestion or pedestrian or bicycle safety. So we're going to be able to make material improvements along the 3A corridor as part of that project, but it won't be for the whole corridor. So,
Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the 3A issues were more crash-oriented. So it was auto safety, and those were the crash sites, whereas the Main Street is more congestion, so more experiential. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I would say that.
right, but pedestrian access, safety, and convenience is a major issue along the 3A corridor.
Right.
Yes, definitely.
For sure. Sue?
Just a question. I was speaking to the police chief. He says a lot of those traffic accidents are due to Waze and GPS taking people off the normal course of traffic. Do you guys look at that?
No. Amy?
That's one of my favorite topics, though. I love to tell traffic consultants now, no offense, that every traffic study I hear, I think, don't tell me that the traffic's going to go this way, because if Waze tells me to go the other way, that's what I'm going to do.
And there are a couple of towns that actually have gotten GPS to change. One is
And
in New
that's
Jersey,
what I was
and the other
wondering.
one recently, right? There was an article in the Globe, I think.
Because there was a conversation in Hingham about
Yeah.
ways to move traffic, and do many towns go through the GPS system to avoid those, like Kilby Street?
I wouldn't say
Accidents.
many towns do that, but it has been done. It's a really hard thing to do, though, because it's a public road. It's hard to tell people they can't use it.
I just wasn't educated on that.
Yeah.
I heard something about it.
But unfortunately, we don't really have a way to attribute crashes to that sort of redirection. There's no real way to look at the data and tell that that's. I mean, it's certainly like anecdotally you could say that is adding to it, but there's no real way to look in a crash report and say this wouldn't have happened if Waze didn't tell this person to go this way, But it's not to say it's not an issue. It definitely probably is.
On that same note, do you have any data on the various peer towns that have adopted the lower speed limit of 25? Because I feel like that is very common now.
Yeah, a
in
lot
places
of
like
towns are
Dedham
doing
that
that.
have like a 109, which is a state highway, which is somewhat similar to 228, with very residential in nature. They've adopted the 25.
Yeah, lots of towns have done that.
Townwide, Adrian?
What?
That's a townwide adoption?
Townwide.
Yeah, so wherever the speed limit is not posted, it would be like a default speed limit of 25.
That was a red dot issue, I think.
Yes, it was.
Yes.
I know that this has come up and there's been various
No, but I'm
opinions
just
on
wondering
it.
if the data on peer towns, if it works.
It may have been an interim red dot.
So Lexington has done it.
Okay, if it works or not. I don't know if it works. It's so new.
It is new.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's definitely something that you can explore. That would be up to the town whether they want to pursue that.
Right. I think they want to know if it works, so is there data to
Right.
show?
I don't think yet there's
I
data
think
to
it's
show
too
that.
early.
Yeah.
It's too early.
But it allows you to give somebody a speeding ticket on a road that doesn't have a posted speed
Right.
limit. So
Right.
you have to. It's increased enforcement as well because of
I know it's made me slow down.
Okay, there's a data point.
Other high-level thoughts or questions on transportation?
Just for sort of the design approach to traffic, I know we had talked about it, but the road calming measures, through design, being able to slow down traffic,
Yeah.
is that a piece of what would be presented
It
here.
definitely can be, if that's something that the town would be interested in, using those sort of like vertical design, narrowing lanes, landscaping along the sides of roads just to visually slow motorists down. On street parking, you can alternate the sides of the street the parking is on to just create a visually narrowing effect. So there's a lot that can be done in order to just slow motorists down that way. So it's definitely something to consider
Certainly
in future
Where
designs.
pedestrians are concerned, I think
Yes,
that's.
definitely. And some
The
towns have-
combination of making a shorter pedestrian path and also.
Yeah, the bump outs to make the
Um,
pedestrian crossing shorter. Some towns specifically will do a traffic calming project and they'll put up a sign that says this is a traffic calming area. And Westwood has done that in a few locations. Yeah, so it's an option, for sure.
Paul?
Question, the transportation demand management strategy, where is that typically found within a town?
Burlington, Lexington.
Is it a bylaw?
Oh, yeah.
Or is it
Oh, yeah.
part
Yep.
of the
Part of
zoning bylaw?
Yep.
Any one of those forms? Is it something like voted on by the town?
It's
to
in the zoning
pursue?
bylaw,
Oh,
In the-
okay.
yeah.
All right.
Right now, the planning board conditions those on a
Right.
project-by-project basis as part of our
The
project
A3.
review for A2s and site plans.
Right.
You remember under the Station Street project edit. So they're suggesting we put the performance criteria right in the bylaw.
Right.
All right, we're moving fast, but this is not, as I keep saying, not the only opportunity for comments. I want to make sure that if there are specific ones for the consultants or that you want the committee members to hear. So moving on to housing, are there any comments or questions on the slides in the presentation on housing?
You brought up short-term housing.
Short-term rentals?
Yeah, short-term rental. Is that prevalent? Did you find that prevalent in Hingham, or?
Oh, you should go on Airbnb and see how many hits there are for Hingham. It's significant.
So anecdotally, across the country, we're seeing Airbnb drive-up rentals in the area. In fact, in some ski communities, it's basically driven the locals out of it.
Right. You go to Nantucket. I mean, the impact of it is huge. You don't have to go to ski areas. You can just go right to Cape Cod.
And there's nothing in our bylaws or any.
This is all new. This whole kind of regulating short-term rentals and requiring people to register them and pay what amounts to an occupancy tax. This is all really new stuff. So you're not going to find a lot of it yet. I know I was looking at the Department of Revenue site last week just to see how many towns have already adopted something around the short-term rental tax. And they're starting to show up. You know, it's the Amherst, it's the South Hadley, it's the college towns are doing it. The coastal towns on the North Shore seem to have latched onto it. So, you know, the reason I brought it up is that there is this relationship between short-term rental units and the supply of housing for permanent occupancy. And so at some point, it becomes a market factor where, you know, it's no longer what's the house worth, but what's the bedroom in it worth? Because now it's a revenue generator. So, you know, if that's going to be a pattern in your community and maybe you don't want to stop it, some towns are very reluctant to regulate short-term rentals to somehow prevent them, but the opportunity to then collect some revenue to address affordable housing is very appealing to some communities. So we just wanted to make you aware of this, that that's a possibility for capitalizing the Housing Trust Fund.
I think we should talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's the next 10 to 15 years. It's going to happen. So I think we should address it in the master plan in some way.
On the agenda.
Slide 32, just wanted a clarification on the, this calculation of rent to household income.
Yes, yep.
How are you getting at those numbers? How accurate?
The American Community Survey from the Census Bureau tracks this every year. So we have good historic data back to 1997 in terms of every year, and we have decennial data really back to 1940, actually. But it's a measure of when you take the sort of the median rent in your community, whatever that number is, and what that slide is talking about is, what is that as a percentage of household income? So, it's not uncommon for renter households to be more cost burdened than homeowners. It's just kind of the nature of things. It's not uncommon to see renters paying maybe 32, 35% of their income for rent. I'm not justifying it, I'm just saying that tends to be the case.
Yeah.
But when you see numbers like 44.9%, that's very significant, and there's not another town on the South Shore
Yeah.
where we see a median gross rent as a percentage of household income that's anywhere near that high.
How accurate is that denominator part, that household income piece in that?
Well, it's the data collected, I mean,
Is it?
I'm not, I don't,
No, I'm just wondering if it's near-term data that you've had, or if it's old, kind of, how?
no, it's from 2018.
Okay, all right.
They do it every year. The American Community Survey is now every year. It's an estimate.
Yeah.
It's based on a sampling of the population. I actually was in a meeting earlier today where someone had gotten an ACS survey and wondered why she had received it and why it says she has to respond as a matter of law. It's because the Census Bureau has that kind of power. But in the survey, the households are asked, what's your income? And then what are you paying for housing costs? And that's how the number comes
So
about.
it's kind of, it's a market force kind of.
Yes, it
issue.
is.
It's not something that, it's choices that people are making here. It's not something that we're, I don't know if it's something that we can control so much.
Oh, sure you can. You can absolutely regulate the pricing of affordable housing units. Yes, you can, if you have the zoning to do it, or even through a comprehensive permit. But it's easier through zoning, because then at that point you can say, we want to tailor our affordable units to people, let's say, I'm just making up numbers, households at 60% of area median income. So now you've brought the rents down to a level where they're probably more affordable for people who are actually renting.
Okay.
Is the proportion of, how does the proportion of our housing stock that's available rental compare with other South Shore communities?
Oh, you have quite a bit of rental housing, because you've done a fair amount of comprehensive permit activity here.
Okay.
And one of the things that's driving that number, I just want to make this clear, the irony is, it's comprehensive permits, because if you think about it, 25% of the units in a rental development have to be affordable. So those are theoretically affordable, but the rest of them, the 75% of the units are market rate, and they tend to rent at very high rents because it's new, they're marketing it as luxury housing. So in a way, that's kind of exacerbating the problem, because you've done a fair amount of rental development here, and it's recent, it's new, fairly new, compared with other South Shore towns. That's tugging at this number.
Right, but to Hans's point, though, that, I mean, you can regulate the affordable housing, but this is the total number, right? There are people, particularly first-time home buyers, I'll speak for myself in 2014, when we bought our first house, we were paying a big number of our income on that, on housing, anticipating, luckily correctly, that incomes would go up and you'd be able to manage it. But lots of people do that for their first home purchase, right?
Right, but we don't talk about housing cost burden for people like you and me. Housing cost burden is a function of being low or moderate income. And that choice is different. I can choose to pay, you can choose to pay a bunch of our income for a house because we want to buy into a community and hope to God we're going to make more money 10 years out, and that mortgage payment becomes affordable. But when you're low income,
I'm not disputing the point. I just don't know whether those numbers are in here as well, and is it skewing the number a little bit?
Right,
That's-
so just to clarify the formula, is it just the 40B housing or all rental?
They don't, the survey doesn't isolate.
So it's
40B.
counting the luxury apartments. So
That's
that
what I'm
does skew
saying.
it skews it a bit, I think.
But if you have that many low or moderate income people who are housing cost burdened, it's a significant number.
Well, you're making an
And
assumption that they're lower moderate income housing.
That's how it's done. That's how that metric is done.
This is gross rent of all rental in town, you said.
It's median gross rent for the household, the rents that are affordable at or below 80%.
Okay, well then, we should clarify
Yes,
this, because
so
that's not what,
let's
that's not
clarify
what
that.
this
So-
says.
Because that, that
So
was my
this
misunderstanding.
implies a broader metric, and that's not what we're talking about then.
I think what I'm trying to explain to you is that when you have a large inventory of market rate rental housing, and a lot of people are paying for that more than they can afford, that's something you want to know. Whether you do anything about it is totally up to you as a town. But to your point, there are things you can do, even beyond zoning. The town of Chatham, for years, has created a rental assistance program with CPA funds to help low-income renters afford where they live. So it's a question of what do you want to do? And it may be you don't want to do anything. But we feel like we need to bring this to you and you at least be aware
I
that
think
your
Chatham-
rental market is very high relative to the incomes of renters.
Right. Chatham is not a good example here, because one of the reasons they did that program, just like Nantucket, if you use the housing rate in Chatham that's normal, it's higher than most people can afford, and Chatham therefore loses its domestic labor, using that term, for shops, for the summertime, for a lot of things that they need labor for. Otherwise, you do what they do on Nantucket, which is fly them from Hyannis to Nantucket every morning. I think Hingham, every town has its own, this is getting into a hairy area.
Yeah, I know.
Every town has its own character.
Right.
It drives that character by the nature of the dollar.
Yep.
We can control the economic performance of a town. I was chairman of the Cohasset Planning Board. All we had to do was do a zoning change, and we'd either boost the tax rate or whatever. Every town has the right to make that decision, and should have the right to make the decision if they decide they want to maintain the character of the town, right?
That's
As
true.
it is now. You
Absolutely.
can't maintain the character of Hingham right now, for most of it anyhow, without having high real estate values and high rents. And so you also, by implication, in the affordable housing side, also have to have access to the jobs that don't penalize people in that mid-range of income. So it's a very, very tricky balance of how you create jobs to support affordable housing.
Can I just jump in for a second? That's not why Chatham did that program. They did it because they were rebuilding public housing, and they didn't want to displace their tenants.
Okay,
So
but
just
it
so
was
you know
public
what the
housing,
genesis was.
And it has the same net effect.
But I'm just saying that they did it to protect those tenants, and they kept the program going.
Right.
Once that public housing was
Sure,
rebuilt.
and that's public housing. Do we have public housing?
Let's bring it back to Hingham. if
And
you're-
also, it depends on how you define character,
Well,
correct?
that's
go right ahead.
absolutely correct.
That's another meeting.
I just want to add one point, and then we'll move on from this. Go ahead.
I just wanted to emphasize, again, that a big part of this is just telling you the findings and telling you the opportunities, and then the town can decide what to do with that. So if you look at the surrounding towns, so that median gross rent as a percentage of household income in the past 12 months, Hingham, it is 44.9%. Cohasset, 34.8%. Hull, 34.7, Norwell, 32.4. So the point that we're just making, and then you do with it what you will, is that it is disproportionately higher for your town. That's all.
I agree with you. That's not an argument.
Because they don't have the vote.
Help us put a little context around this by just the percentage of renters in Hingham. I think that would go a long way, at least for me, to help understand how big an issue is this really?
So, 18.6, oh, this is house,
That's renter occupied.
Yeah, renter
20%,
occupied.
Basically 20%.
20% of Hingham is renting? Is that?
Roughly.
18.6, yeah, compared to,
Cohasset's 25. Plymouth County's 24%.
so a lot of this information will also be, and so tonight you guys are getting the inventory and assessment for sustainability and for facilities. When you get the one for housing, a lot of this data will be in there for you to see and, to see laid out more clearly. Right now, this is just the big takeaways, but we're not telling you what to do with it. We're presenting the information and telling you what the opportunities are.
These are the decisions we have to make.
Exactly.
And they're big decisions.
They are.
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, on slide 30, we talk about affordable housing, and then the last note on it talks about local workforce. So I'm a little concerned about putting workforce housing in a category with affordable housing, unless I'm misunderstanding what this is about, but there is a category called workforce housing, which is not affordable housing, but more affordable housing. Am I
Okay.
right?
In the housing world, we don't use those terms that way. People who are at 60 or 50% of area median income work. So workforce it's this term of art. When we talk about the local workforce, we're talking about the jobs in the community and what they pay.
Okay.
That's
So-
not the same as the labor force, which is your residents.
Okay, so what I'm asking, I guess, and I'm not doing it in a very good way apparently, is that there seems to be a need in Hingham. We've satisfied our affordable housing, but there seems to be a need in Hingham for houses that are, our housing stock is too expensive. So a 35 or 40-year-old person trying to come into this town can't come into this town. So,
Or they're paying half their income for rent.
well, they can't buy in this town. Or if
Right.
they buy a house, they have to spend $200,000
Yep.
to repair it.
Yep.
So should we look at creating opportunities where we have smaller lots,
Sure.
more open space, and create opportunities to have, you're going to have to tell me the right word, more affordable housing, but it's not affordable housing.
Small A affordable
yeah.
housing, let's say that.
Small
right?
A affordable housing, and addressing that, particularly in areas where we have opportunities to create communities that could support, again, smaller lots, but more open space, more parks,
We have that.
you know,
Preservation of starter homes, Mike, is sort of along the lines of what you're talking about, right?
yes.
Yeah, which is why we talked about the tear downs.
Okay, so is that something that we should?
I think it'll absolutely be part of the conversation, for sure.
I only have one more comment on this. A lot of the feedback that I heard in the various sessions that I went to essentially said, we have too much multifamily housing now, we don't want any more. Again, whether rightly or wrongly, I think that should be reflected in a bullet point here, because that is definitely a sentiment that we hear a lot of in the last couple of years.
We did hear that. We also heard other people saying something different. So it's one of these things
I
where,
have no doubt
you know,
that there
I
are a
think
lot
we
of
kind of
opinions.
acknowledge that there's a difference of opinion in the community. I think we have an obligation to do that. I agree with you.
No,
and one of the
It
things-
should be reflected in here as one of
Agreed.
the many mentioned.
You're correct. I agree.
And when I was looking at the survey, I mean, question 11 and question 13, the top three items had to do with in development or
Yep.
the results of development, one way or the other. So,
Yeah.
and then, you know, we're talking about our permitting process being too slow. There's probably people in this town that go, wait a minute, it's not slow enough.
We've heard that, too.
Exactly. I'm sure that's true.
I think that permeates so many of these discussions. I mean, it came up in every visioning session, the conflict, or in some cases
Yep.
hypocrisy between, all right, we want diversity in our town,
Right,
but now we're 10% shut off
So
multifamily
we're good,
development.
right.
right.
Or, you know, we don't want more development, so we can't zone for smaller lots and smaller homes, right? You just have this inherent conflict that people want this, but they don't want to pay the price for it, which means higher density developments with more affordable rents and more affordable pricing. And it's going to be, you know, it permeates housing issues, it permeates the zoning issues, permeates the land use issues,
Transportation issues.
transportation
Sure.
issues, economic development, it's just.
I'm not sure it's hypocrisy, I think it's just two different opinions. I don't think you
Yes.
often find them in the same person.
Oh,
Yes.
we literally did. We literally did, we had our visioning session, we had a couple, and they said, we need more diversity in town, we want it across ages and rents and incomes.
We want our kids to be able to afford a house.
Afford the house, and 3 minutes later, they said, we've got to stop development in this town. And I literally looked at her and I said, you see the hypocrisy in this? And she said, to her credit, yes, I do. She acknowledged it.
So one of the documents you're going to get tonight, in addition to the 2 inventory and assessments that you're getting, is the proposed vision and goals. And you will see in that document that the desire to preserve the single-family character of Hingham was mentioned a lot. We quote that in the survey, from the survey responses quite a bit. So it is addressed. Again, this is just kind of relaying the housing findings and opportunities so far, but you will see that in the vision and goals, which we probably should talk about. But how many more?
I think we just want to do open space and public facilities if we
Okay.
can briefly.
Okay.
And again, I've been pretty good about getting us out at 9 o'clock in the previous meetings. I'm going to indulge a little bit so that we can get through this, but I promise not to go over too much. And I don't want to give these short shrift, but I will say again, this is just the beginning, and there are going to be lots of opportunities for us to address these. Open space, any major questions or comments on those? We will be efficient.
I've seen a statistic where 50% of the area of Hingham is, roughly 50%, is open space and conservation land. I think the 4,000 acre number that you all use doesn't include our portion of Wampatuck. I may be wrong, I can't remember.
We can check.
Yeah.
But it's,
Because it sounds small if you include Wampatuck as well, right? That,
right.
yeah.
2,500.
So you're probably right.
We'll verify.
Yeah.
I have a question. When we talk about open space and management of open space, are we talking about the management of what Hingham owns? Because the trustees in Wampatuck are privately,
Yeah.
or not the Wampatuck estate.
Right.
But that was one of my questions of what are we talking about?
What your town can do.
Yeah. I think
It's a master
probably-
plan for
Master
Hingham.
plans for the
So
town.
it's really going to talk about what you can do
And
as a
then,
community.
do we ever want to talk about what influence we have on those
Could be, sure.
private
That's up-
and state, or those other owners
You
of
could,
open
if
space?
that's important to
I guess
you.
I'm asking that to
Yeah.
board.
Well,
Or to the-
yeah.
As a throw out when we get to this section.
I'm pretty sure you're never going to get me to say, no, we're not going to talk about X, right? So,
Add it to the list.
yeah, so add it to the list, I would say.
Under open space and recreation, I noticed no mention at all of the country club. And I didn't know whether in all of the visioning and,
It's in the inventory and in the visioning, yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll have Martha's documents soon. So some of this information, I think you'll find in there, and if it's not, then we need to address it.
Each chapter is many pages long, these were just kind of the key.
You have a comment or a section here at the end that says the town will need to balance support for expanded recreation fields, et cetera, with other things. Well, that's really true of everything in there. So they're all trade-offs. I'm not sure it should be highlighted here any more so than under the other categories, so. Seems like you're picking on that one.
Other thoughts on, a little movement down there.
So lots going on.
That's right. Must be the hour. So the historic and cultural resources, and we don't have that information yet, right? That's what.
No, but it's coming.
It's coming.
We just didn't have a chance to finish formatting it for
Yeah,
tonight.
no, that's fine. It's going to be a lot to digest what you're giving to us now, right?
Right.
So the fact that it's
figured.
going to be phased is probably fine.
Yeah.
But I do think that will inform a lot of this
Yep.
stuff on the
Agreed.
historic side a lot more than we have here. But as it does on slide 19, Mike, for your point, it's the loss of the smaller homes as well, just another mention of that.
Which category are you in?
I'm in historic now.
I have a question about your 10% of historic buildings. Let's see, local historic district covered just 10% of historic buildings. That doesn't sound right to me. Somebody else, I think, said there were 700 houses in the historic districts, and there are about 7,000 single-family homes in Hingham, so.
We can ask Martha to double-check that.
Yeah, we'll double check that.
Yeah, I
And
think that's a pretty good number, 700 for, in the historic districts, there's
Yeah.
about 700 homes in
So
those 7
again-
districts.
That's like 10% of all the houses in Hingham.
Yeah.
So I think it's not quite correct to say it covers just 10% of the historic buildings.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, that's right. I think that's,
Yeah.
the intent was all of the homes, I think.
Because you have the inventory also.
Right.
And those are outside of the district.
Right.
Yeah.
Another 800 or 900 on that.
True. But, so then it's 50%. In other words.
We'll
just-
ask Martha to check it.
Just want to get that right.
No, that's exactly what this exercise is for, Jerry. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think it would be interesting on the next topic, the demolition delay bylaw, to put some real numbers in there as well, rather than, half of this or 25% of that, just so that people understand what the real numbers are versus proportions of.
I actually did have those in one of the housing slides. The data, yes. Yeah, I got it from Emily. So,
That was interesting.
yeah.
Has there been any legal constraint on a demolition regulation as to time? And I ask that because depending, if somebody wants to tear down a house, they own the house, they have the right to tear it down. If you have too much time, that could fall into the concept of a taking.
Taking, yes. This is an oft-discussed topic among historic preservationists in Massachusetts. What is too much? And so the general feeling right now is 2 years you probably can get away with. There are towns that have a 2-year delay. And to my knowledge, it hasn't been litigated yet.
Getting away with, probably not with me, you could probably not get away with it.
I mean, there's a big controversy about this. Some people want to preserve that stock and they'll support an extended delay, but people who own a house, who have, expectations about perhaps being able to maximize the value of it by selling it to somebody who's going to tear it down because they're going to build a bigger house, they don't often come to town meeting and say, I just love the idea of a 2-year delay.
Right.
It's the same is true with mansionization. People think that we should be doing something to control these large houses. But for folks who actually want to have a huge house, they'll go to town meeting and talk too and say, I don't want you putting an excessive regulation on my ability to use my property as I choose. So these are not easy.
So that's a reasonableness argument.
Yeah.
As opposed to.
Yeah. What's the legitimate
foundation law
what's the
side.
legitimate government interest?
Good. All right.
Regarding the catalog of historic records, my understanding is the town clerk is in charge of many records in town, and we got a vault here in the basement of Town Hall. I'm not sure I understand that topic and what's covered by historic records that people are thinking is somehow lacking.
I think the question is, how are the public records being managed? Who's managing them? Who's going through records and making decisions about what should be kept versus what can be discarded? Really, it's the job any archivist does in any library,
But I
You
mean,
have-
like, what records? What, every department in town,
Yeah.
every piece
There
of paper?
there are all kinds of records that
I can-
departments
yeah,
have. I
can
mean,
answer it, like the health department, I have 65% of the town's septic records
Yeah.
in my office down there, and they just grow, so it's more to scan them in PDF. That's a huge need for space in all the departments.
right.
Yes, sorry, Mary?
And if I can add, just to answer your question, we did have a meeting that was very valuable, and some of the other records we talked about, I don't think anyone else here was at that meeting, was, for example, Jerry Duff maintains a lot of the records for the Girl Scout House
Yeah.
and the Fire Museum. We do have a climate-controlled space in the library where we keep some records, but not a lot. Some of our most critical records are in the state.
Right.
And we've talked about, is there an opportunity to bring tourism into Hingham for historic purposes and maybe historic research? We'd rather have people come to Hingham to do research than go into Boston. So it's not just the municipal records. Certainly, we're bursting at the seams. We do love paper here, but there's so many different, not town, but stewards of our historic
Right.
records here, mostly nonprofits. So it's all of them, and we talked about the fact that those are resources, even though they're not town of Hingham. They're the, bigger town, and we need to think about preserving some of those things or cataloging them. Some people have things that we don't even know
Right.
are there, and that's what one of the things that is so valuable to the town, and people will come here and spend money here to have access to that. And right now, we can't even tell you what's at the library, what's in the vault, you know, what's where. I know some people keep things at their house, right? So that's just
Good context, thank you.
And one more thing is sometimes towns will have a lot of people come to see who's in their cemeteries, believe it or not, and to have those archived and organized and accessible to the public in a space that's easy to navigate is something that's another way of bringing people into town to spend more money.
Or just to see it.
Or just to see it.
Or just to see it.
We could charge a fee for them to see it.
You got to fix those gateways first.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. The gateways. Oh, that was good.
All right, let's spend a moment on public facilities, which we'll be talking about in earnest on May 18th.
March 18th.
March 18th, sorry. I've got May on the brain for later in the agenda, sorry.
Question on slide 14. Are there any upcoming issues that the town faces regarding our fire, police infrastructure that we're not adhering, or we may not be in the future adhering to kind of code because of population growth, because of, you know,
There are a
existing
couple of
infrastructure?
areas where you do exceed
Response time?
your response time. Do you want me to find what they are?
No, I'm just curious if
Yeah,
there's,
so
if
there are a
there's
couple
something
of
that.
places where it's difficult, but
Yeah.
nothing extreme.
Okay.
But just the buildings themselves, they're not really up to par in terms of modern apparatus, modern ways of doing things. And then if you're having both women and men.
I was just gonna bring that up.
Are, you know, firefighters, they need to have separate facilities, which they're able to do somehow, but not really in a way that's, and many towns are having a hard time recruiting new fire and police, and one of the ways they do that is by having state-of-the-art facilities.
Are the response times for medical aid or fire calls?
I believe they're fire calls, but I can check that.
Sorry. I'll make sure that I capture some of these things as well. Liza?
You say in 12 that Foster School is going to be in a flood zone and is going to be flooded by 2030, I believe. And this, where did that
Better not be a problem.
come
So there's
from?
a municipality vulnerability report that catalogs all of your facilities and when they will be, you know, when is sort of the absolute maximum time that you need to address them. And so the Foster School is in that category, which is the first category, 2030, and then it kind of phases the rest of it.
Is that the 75-year, is this, I guess, I don't know which report this.
Is it
The Kleinfeld
100-year
report, right?
storm?
Yeah, the Kleinfeld
Kleinfeld report?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. I believe that was the parking lot of the,
I believe it was also the basement, and they had started talking about how.
Okay. All right, so I know we've looked at moving the building over on the site.
Right.
Are you saying, because of your study, to relocate Foster School off of the entire property? Or
No, because
just?
I haven't done a study.
We're not doing a site study.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that all those who have done a study are saying it needs to be moved out of the flood zone.
Okay.
And mostly it seems to be being considered on the site, somewhere else on the site.
Yeah, which, yeah, that is the plan.
Right.
So, and that's been studied, so I just wanted to make sure you weren't proposing.
No.
But it
So
sounds-
we should make
sounds
that
like
clear perhaps.
I was confused on that too, because when I read it, it sounded like the
Yeah.
whole site was in the flood zone.
Yeah.
So maybe we could clarify
we need to
if it's,
clarify.
because
And
the
also,
parking lot
just the way
is-
that sentence is structured too, that it would experience a significant increase in flooding, where it doesn't flood now, so
But the
it
parking
doesn't.
lot's in a low-lying area and it abuts the wetlands. So I think if
I know,
As waters rise, that it would.
but there's an AE zone that goes
midway into the
Yeah.
parking lot. I have never seen that actually flooded.
Yeah, I mean,
And at times when other areas have entirely flooded. So I'm just saying, to say that it's an increase in flooding when, other than the roof leaks.
that's a different issue, yeah.
Water's falling, not rising.
But if you feel that,
Yeah, if we could
I
just
just
have never seen it, and I live right
clarify.
near there.
I think we have
flood
to be
area.
sensitive to the fact that we found out in December that we've been admitted into the MSBA program,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
the state is not going to let us rebuild that building
Right.
in the flood
flood
zone.
zone. Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
you know, we just-
It will be studied in much detail.
Oh, in much detail. okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
So,
It's just identified because it will be a capital expenditure
oh, yeah, it's probably the largest one
coming up.
that we know of. Maybe this will give us
And-
something else.
and
But-
likely a topic at town meeting this year for additional study funding, yes?
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, it's already on the radar.
Right.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so we just need to make sure that it's accurate and not incendiary
Right, exactly.
information.
No, I'm glad that you pointed that out.
run out of town?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to make that job more difficult.
Advisory.
Right. Other thoughts on public facilities?
Slide 13, Hingham has the highest percentage of people over 65 in the South Shore. What is that number?
What is the number? I can tell you.
And how does that stack up versus Cohasset and Orwell? Do you
I
have
don't
any-
have that, but we could, I think it's in the study
Okay.
that was done. Let's see. So 2010, 5,735 Hingham residents are age 60 and over, which represent 26% of the town's population.
So that's 2010?
Correct. Another 5,139, aged 49 to 59, were next in line, right, to
So,
venture to that category. And the majority said they wanted to age here.
okay, so 2020, 10 years later, guess is 30%? I mean, what do we?
Let's see.
So we've been
That's
working on the housing plan.
Yeah.
And,
Right.
which we're trying to, and this is a question that's come up for me, is how much has when you look at, it's increased by 55%, how much has Linden Ponds impacted?
Oh, I think Linden Ponds is a
Other-
huge factor.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
is
gotta
it
be.
a
On the
one-time
outside.
big bump in
Yeah.
growth?
Yeah.
And that is a lot of people from outside.
Right.
So is that a continuous
that a
curve, or is this a bump?
I
And
think
then
that- I think
that
that's-
we should take that out.
MAPC said that they anticipate 66% increase ages 70 to 74 from 2010 to 2020, and a 58% increase in ages 80 to 84 from 2020 to 2030.
So those are giant numbers.
Yes.
But not that uncommon.
It's possible a lot of that could be within Linden Ponds.
It is Linden Ponds.
Absolutely.
That is.
Right.
Yeah.
They're moving in at 65 plus and going
Yes.
to whatever.
Which brings up a question for me about the senior center, which I acknowledge we need.
Right.
But with only 14% of people using the senior center, is it because they're getting those needs met
At Linden
within
Ponds.
Linden Ponds?
So
And so-
some apparently are, but also, this has been what we've been told, is that one is the parking issue, and that's not uncommon in senior centers,
Yeah.
that parking is a problem. The other is that there isn't a van that will pick them up to bring them. And then the perception, that it's for very elderly, very frail, low-income people.
Right.
And so if that's the
Doesn't become
perception,
the
there are
center.
other people who, I mean, it's also becoming more and more the case that people don't want it to be called a senior center.
Right, and that was definitely popular in the visioning sessions I
Yeah.
was in, to
Yeah.
have it be a multi-age
Yeah.
kind of
Multi-generational,
sort of
community
rec
center.
center, senior center.
Right, and there was the age-friendly event that was
But
held.
I'm just saying that, I know that the seniors in particular have been speaking up about that need, and that when you look at the demographic numbers as this huge population of seniors, it just would be good to acknowledge, and it's not to cordon them off, but the Linden Ponds.
Is a
folks
contributing factor.
Is a contributing factor.
So,
No,
I think I do
actually,
say this.
they have their own services.
They do have.
What are they- I
And
think-
so they're not necessarily going to be
Right.
using all of this.
All of it,
Like,
right.
they are impacting the ambulance runs.
Oh, absolutely.
Scams,
Yeah.
that type of thing.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I think we need to be careful of
Mm-hmm.
distinguishing the different populations of seniors that we have, and to make sure that, I sent you those two
Yes.
demographic
Yes.
studies, to make sure we're also using as current information as we have, because there is some
And
data
let's-
around town that is based on 2010 census making assumptions.
Right.
Which, and there is newer data available that we should.
It's really that they're different methodologies. Both MAPC and the Donahue Institute do projections, and they use a very different methodology. So I'm not surprised to hear that you think the Donahue Institute numbers are more accurate.
Well, but we
hear this
also have
often.
the school enrollment study
yes.
that was using town census data.
I understand.
So,
Compare apples to
Yeah,
apples.
so
And back out some of this growth that we've
Yeah.
had from Linden and
right,
Pines.
right.
And I think, because in the sessions, we're hearing that, empty nesters and seniors, they're getting priced out, there's
Yep.
nowhere to go. But these numbers don't indicate that. And a lot of that, I think, is because of,
Linden Ponds. Yeah.
Potentially, or.
Yeah.
or maybe not.
Or maybe not, but I think broadly, the demographics question is really key to this, because
Yeah.
we're going to be
Sure.
relying on it. So getting comfortable on
And
that
we
set of
haven't-
numbers
we haven't
and that
gotten
set
to
of,
it well in
that
the
methodology.
housing plan. We haven't gotten to it. And
Right.
I don't think we're going to with
mean,
the housing plan, so.
But we actually can get at this, because we can take population numbers down to the census block group.
Right.
So, if we just do that, we'll be able to tell to what extent is Linden Ponds driving this, just because we can take it down to a small geography. So we can do that.
And then we can take that number and look at how many people are really using our senior center, and then how many people are using the facilities at Linden Pond.
right.
And then one more follow-up question is, in affluent communities, with our aging population, they have their own car. What do other communities do that these people are driving their they don't commute, they don't carpool together to use the senior center? Is that a problem in affluent communities like Hingham?
Yes, because at some point, seniors should not be driving their own car. They should get off the road. So,
You get to tell them that.
I'm not going to say that.
Can I ask one quick question? I have two questions. The number one, there are a couple of things that come up here: school, library, senior center, right? So are there any examples, or, and you may not know this now, but just like for the future, examples or practices? And one thing that popped off my head was Plymouth South High School has the senior center
Right.
attached to it. So as we go forward as a town and we're thinking about all these capital projects, like thinking about what are some best practices, right? That if you can kind of combine capital projects, what can they be? And that may give us some opportunity.
Lincoln has been doing, Lincoln is doing the same thing.
and then the other really common one now is doing a community center has separate entrances. So older adults can come in from here, because some older adults, especially ones that feel a little frail, they might not necessarily want to be rushing in with the teens. And then there's some spaces.
Some of us who aren't frail don't want to be rushing in with them either.
And then there's some spaces dedicated to older adult activities, and then there's some shared spaces, so it really increases efficiencies, the cost, as well as in programming, because you can do co-programming. And those who want intergenerational activities, it's right there.
But I even think the library, right? And like space for programming and whatnot, and think about our library uses a lot of the space for programming in the evening.
Right.
Probably most seniors aren't going out.
They're not going out. But apparently in the library, there's not enough space for tutoring, so even for the students that come after school, there's not enough space for them to do the tutoring. They have to go elsewhere. So, yeah.
Yes.
I was like, oh,
Is-
because I would go there. And I'm like, oh, really?
Is the base demographic data and housing data, is that what we're getting tonight, or when will we be getting the base data?
Couple of weeks.
Okay. 'Cause it just seems like,
We need
like we're
to,
talking around these issues, if we can get the data in front before we talk about the topics, it would inform the discussions.
well, you are getting data in these different ones, but
We're getting pieces, but base housing data,
Yep.
demographic data, income data would
Yep.
be really helpful, because it cuts across housing, public
It does.
facilities, economic development. I feel like we're just talking about it, and then we're going to talk about it again when we get the data.
You probably will. Yeah, no,
This was
yeah.
just like a first cut.
I have a somewhat related question. When we get that demographic data, will we also get the demographic data from the respondents, both in the vision sessions and also in the surveys?
It was inconsistent.
And, no, my point is, well, I mean, I did take some notes here, like 40, on the survey, 43.8% of the people in the survey were over 55, but that doesn't reflect the demographics in the community. I'm just,
Well,
I would,
Right, I mean, that's going to be the vagary of the survey, right? We can't.
yeah, but is it, is it important to understand that there are some, so 63.4% had no kids in school. So the survey, so is there a way that we can understand that better and maybe think about it, like?
One of the problems we have is that we don't have demographic data from the visioning sessions.
Right.
So it's hard to compare the survey to the visioning, the bodies who actually showed up for various.
But we do have visual.
Well,
So
yeah,
we do
but
have
not,
some
but we don't
sense.
have it for all of
For
them.
not all of them.
We don't, because we
only
didn't
had it
have
for the
most of
two
them.
We
Yeah.
only had it for the two.
I mean, I understand it's not perfect, I just,
Yeah, it's context, I think, Mike. I think you just need to look at it in that,
Yep.
and
Yep.
understand that it probably isn't 100% representative of the actual demographics of the town, but it's still informative.
So one of the things that was interesting, with that regard in the 103 or something page visioning summary, was that different groups that had the meetings in the boxes had very different priorities. So while we don't have, say, age demographic data, we know that, for example, the people who attended the Special Needs Athletic Partnership, the needs that they identified were very different than the people who attended I remember the Ralph's Wine was very family oriented. It was, we want more harbor amenities and fun things.
It's like up there.
Yeah, and then, so we don't, we do try and address that
Yep.
in the visioning summary that, yes, different groups have different priorities. How to put a number on that and weighing it, I mean, that's a bit difficult, but it's important to be aware that, yes, there are different.
There isn't one homogeneous set of needs in Hingham.
Right.
And also, to come up with a vision and goals is really both a science and an art.
right,
And it's not only about the numbers, and it's also using our kind of collective experience at looking at the town and what its needs are, so.
and that's actually was my point.
So, the last piece is sustainability with a few minutes, unless you have one more.
Thing, I'm
Of course,
sorry,
Jerry.
on the facilities.
Yep.
The last point about capital planning, we have a very active and well-established capital outlay committee that addresses capital planning on a kind of a smallish scale, I would say. And that is distinct from building planning and management. And I think it really is worthwhile somehow dividing that up, because I think the Capital Outlay Committee would take umbrage at the statement here that it's, poorly organized and needs improvement. But it is certainly true that there are some people in town that think the actual process of planning and managing our buildings as distinct from all capital does need improvement. So I think if we, I think it needs to be
So
subtly divided up.
differentiate that more.
Yes,
Because we did hear repeatedly from many staff that they themselves felt that the process wasn't clear to them and how decisions were made wasn't clear.
No, I don't know.
Jerry, if I can jump on that.
Yeah.
The call for more robust, long-term, big project capital planning is coming in part out of the Capital Outlay Committee.
Good for them.
They see themselves doing a decent job at what I'll call kind of operational capital.
Yes.
But the town not getting its arms around the bigger picture.
Right, and I think, and that reinforces my thought here, that it's kind of two different things. And, capital includes police cars and desks in the office and all that stuff, but buildings really are kind of different. And if capital outlay is now coming forward and saying, we really should kind of divide it up and make the building-oriented stuff a little bit more organized and centralized rather than from one department to the next, I think it's worth describing.
But even that practice varies from community to community. If you do your police vehicle purchases through capital budget, many towns do that as part of the operating budget. The assumption is you have to buy a police cruiser every year. So even that is kind of something that that may or may not be the same here as it is in other places. I think, my experience in communities that have a really, I hate the word robust, but I'm going to use it, capital planning process, all of that is very integrated. It's capital outlay, it's short-term debt, it's long-term debt, it's buildings, it's sewer pipes, it's water mains, it's all of that. It's vehicle replacement, it's the whole picture. So, I just want you to know there are various ways this is done in other communities, which may or may not interest you, but.
No, I certainly get that.
And it's about just taking a look at it kind of comprehensively.
I get all that, but again, there are a lot of communities, for example, that have permanent building committees.
Right.
Rather than doing a building committee established for each and every distinct project. The permanent building committee isn't getting into some of the nitty-gritty that the capital outlay committee feels relatively comfortable with. And again, it's two different types of capital planning. And I think one, I don't know, I feel like we have a decent process that is not satisfactory to everybody all the time, but it's a real process.
But you could just step back and sort of take a look at it anew in a comprehensive way and see what's the best way to do all of that planning. And maybe you end up where you just said, but maybe you don't.
Which we will discuss on the 18th.
Can I just add, last night at the advisory committee meeting, I was in the audience. The Sue Nickerson and the selectmen said that they are going to be studying the capital planning process this summer after the budgeting, this town meeting. So, and they're looking at everything. So they're already addressing.
So let's make a recommendation then, so that we know that
We get credit for it.
Exactly.
Get in first.
Exactly.
That also tends to play out differently in communities depending on how decentralized your government is.
They said they were going to look at other benchmark towns and how they did it as part of their
Right.
process. So
It's a question of how you define benchmark.
yeah, I don't know. They're doing it. That's all I know.
So Jeff, don't take this the wrong way. I'm going to suspend sustainability, if that's all right. We did discuss it in December. We will likely revisit it. We will revisit it at one of the other meetings, but in the interest of time, you guys have been incredibly patient. This has been a terrific conversation. Thank you to everybody. The last item, we don't have minutes this evening, I believe, Mary, right? So that will speed things. We went over the discussion topics earlier. You'll have the materials that you'll walk away with this evening. The last item, and this can be a placeholder, but we have 2 meetings scheduled in May right now, the 20th and the 27th. Sticking to Wednesdays, if we held either the previous Wednesday or, so we can go 3 weeks in a row. We can go 13, 20, 27 in May, potentially, or we can go 6, 20, 27. I don't know if this is going to be an informal poll, but hopefully everybody brought their calendars. It's a lot, it's a sprint. My inclination from a momentum perspective would be to do the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th.
Do we still have April 15th?
I agree, I'd go along with that. Sure.
Second. Say it right inside.
Yeah, that's right.
Gordon, what are we doing on April 15th?
There-
having a meeting in April.
We had, if that's still in your calendars, that was when we were looking at the schedule earlier. Given how involved many of the people who are around this table, including staff, on prepping for town meeting, we decided we would hold April harmless, just because there's enough on everybody's plate, which is why we're dumping so much on you in May.
So we're canceling that?
Oh, it always is.
Okay.
So nothing.
So the April 15th is
It's off,
canceled?
that's right. And I think it's off on the website as well.
March 25th and then bump to May.
So Gordon, may I say something when you're ready for me?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. So with regard to the vision and goals in your packet, wanted to just frame what it actually is. It's the preliminary compilation of what we've heard to date. It's pulling together what we heard at the visioning sessions, going through the, how many pages?
Like 100 pages of notes.
100 pages of notes from the visioning sessions, the survey results, and the core assessment meetings. And it's what did most people say they wanted, but using kind of master planning goals and vision. So it's not about yet what we think or yet what you think. It's about what did we hear. So we want you to say, okay, oh, we heard this and you didn't put, some of you were there, we weren't. We heard this and it's not there. Or, are we sure, let's hold on to this makes me think of this, but that will come later. When you then all give us your feedback, and then we put all our heads together, and it starts to build, we start to build on it. So this is basically the core of what we've heard. So we'd like,
No, go ahead.
So we'd like your feedback on it by March 11th. And basically, we're just kind of throwing it out there for you to react to so that we don't start from zero, right? We'd be here until the end of May doing so.
Right, and it's going to look like, these are a lot of goals, I think, right? And one of the things that we've been talking with the consultants about, I would say since the interview process, and one of the things that they've assured us is their job is to have us come up with achievable goals and recommendations, things that not only can Hingham do, but can do in a timely fashion, right? So it may look blue sky, but the idea is that we start there and we get to the more achievable goals by going through the process.
It's only 7 goals, but there are a lot of objectives associated with each goal. And then each objective will have a series of strategies, so. If we keep them. And then, exactly.
Right.
And these are just, we may not keep them, we may merge them, we may move them, but this is just a compilation of where we hear so far.
So March 11th is the deadline to respond to that document. The responses are going to come to,
I would send them all to Mary,
Mary?
and then can send them to us.
sorry, Mary.
Just ask a
yeah,
quick
please.
process question. At some point, are we aligning these goals to the goals that were defined in 2017?
So those are included in the document.
Okay.
So that will then be one of the next steps, right, is taking those and merging them. But we kept them separate now
Okay.
because they're a separate input.
Sure.
Because again, this is sort of where we are right now. This is what we've heard so far. And these goals relate to these, so they're together, side by side. The next step is to merge them, and then to all of us start changing them, moving them around, merging them, and adding strategies.
Can I just say something to that too? So the way each objective and goal is laid out, it contains the input that got us there, whether it's outlining survey responses, quotes from visioning sessions, quotes from the survey, and also the 2017 goals. And those are all clearly labeled 2017 goals for each element.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not going to ask for criteria on what achievable is. I think leave that up in the air because that takes us to many other places.
Thank you, Bob.
That takes us to midnight.
Other last final thoughts for
Did
the
we
evening?
decide on a date?
Yeah, did we decide on May?
My recommendation is the 13th.
Is that a motion, or do you want to, I'll make that motion?
Three days in May, right?
3 days in May.
13th,
Well,
20th,
three
27th.
dates in May. We may or may not need them, but I think we'll know that when we get there.
So we can
So
free up the
Wednes-
6th.
3 Wednesdays in May, you may free up the 6th. We'll do the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th. And then you'll never want to see me again.
Yeah, I can't find my phone, there it is. Where's my phone? That night scares me, because I think I have a town meeting. It's open. So we're doing 3
Blessings.
in May? That's what you're saying?
We are holding 3 dates in May. Yeah. Again, I'm paranoid, but, there's a lot to cover, and I know how busy everybody is, so I want to get it on the calendars. We'll see how much progress we make. If you get a free evening, you get a free evening, but just in case. What's that?
We took April off.
Right.
Well, sort of. From this, that is absolutely true. That's right. All right, thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.